around 4,700 years ago in the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, something remarkable was happening inside mud brick buildings that would fundamentally shape the trajectory of human civilization. Within these structures, young students sat in rows on clay benches, copying cuneiform signs onto wet clay tablets, while stern instructors paced between them, correcting errors and administering discipline. This wasn't informal apprenticeship or oral tradition transmission. This was formal education, systematized and institutionalized, operating according to standardized curricula, hierarchical administration, and rigorous assessment protocols that bear striking resemblance to modern schooling systems. The archaeological evidence from Nippur, Ur, and other Mesopotamian cities reveals an educational infrastructure of astonishing sophistication, complete with textbooks, examination systems, graduation ceremonies, and professional teaching careers that emerge fully formed in the 3rd millennium BC without clear developmental precursors. The sudden appearance of this complex educational system, like so many aspects of Sumerian civilization, presents a profound puzzle that conventional models of cultural evolution struggle to explain adequately. The University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur between 1889 and 1900 uncovered what would become one of archaeology's most significant discoveries for understanding ancient education. Excavations in the Tablet Hill, designated Area TA by the expedition, revealed thousands of school exercise tablets concentrated in specific buildings that showed unmistakable characteristics of formal educational institutions. The structures, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, but clearly built upon much earlier foundations, contained rows of benches sized for young students, storage areas for tablet archives, and what appeared to be instructor platforms positioned for optimal classroom supervision. The expedition director, John Punnett Peters, initially focused excavation efforts on the temple complex dedicated to Enlil, but team member Hermann Hilprecht recognized the significance of the tablet concentrations in what became designated as Tablet Hill. The sheer density of clay tablets in this area, exceeding 50,000 fragments within a relatively confined space, indicated something far more systematic than casual document disposal. Hilprecht's analysis revealed that the majority of these tablets were not administrative records or religious texts, but rather student exercises showing varying levels of skill and containing identical passages copied repeatedly by different hands. The architectural remains associated with these tablet deposits demonstrated purpose-built educational facilities rather than repurposed domestic or administrative structures. The buildings measured approximately 15 metres by 12 metres, with thick mud brick walls that provided acoustic insulation from external noise. Interior walls divided the space into distinct functional areas, including a large central classroom capable of accommodating 20 to 30 students, smaller rooms that appear to have served as private instruction spaces or administrative offices, and storage chambers with built-in shelving systems designed specifically for organizing clay tablet collections. Most significantly, the excavators uncovered rows of mud brick benches arranged in parallel lines, facing a raised platform at one end of the classroom. Each bench measured approximately 1.2 meters in length and 30 centimeters in width, sized perfectly for seating young students. The spacing between benches allowed instructors to move freely between rows, facilitating individual supervision and correction. The raised platform at the front measured 2 meters by 1.5 meters, providing clear sight lines to all student positions and optimal positioning for oral instruction. Chemical analysis of soil samples from these structures revealed elevated concentrations of clay particles and mineral residues consistent with intensive tablet manufacture and recycling. Ancient Mesopotamian schools reused clay from broken or obsolete tablets, mixing it with water to create fresh writing surfaces. The soil chemistry within these structures showed patterns consistent with thousands of tablets being manufactured, inscribed, dried, and then recycled over extended periods. This evidence confirmed that these buildings functioned as active educational workshops rather than passive storage facilities. The stratigraphic analysis conducted by the expedition revealed multiple building phases at the same location, indicating that educational activity continued at these sites across several centuries. The deepest levels, though poorly preserved, contained tablet fragments and architectural features consistent with educational use dating to the Ur III period around 2100 BC. This suggested that the formal school buildings excavated from the Old Babylonian period represented the culmination of a long tradition of institutionalized education at Nippur rather than a sudden innovation. Comparative analysis of school exercise tablets from Nippur with similar materials from Ur, Sippar, and other Mesopotamian cities revealed remarkable standardization in both content and pedagogical approach. Students at different schools, separated by hundreds of kilometers and sometimes decades or centuries in time, copied identical sign lists, practiced the same vocabulary exercises, and studied the same literary compositions. This standardization could only result from coordinated curriculum development and systematic teacher training programs that ensured consistent educational practices across the broader Mesopotamian world. The physical layout of Sumerian educational institutions demonstrates sophisticated understanding of pedagogical space organization that anticipates modern classroom design principles by millennia. Excavations at Ur conducted by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 revealed school buildings, called a dubba or tablet house in Sumerian, constructed according to standardized architectural specifications that optimized learning environments. The structures incorporated natural lighting through carefully positioned windows, ventilation systems that maintained comfortable temperatures, acoustic properties that enhanced voice projection, and spatial arrangements that facilitated different instructional modes. Woolley's excavations in the residential quarter of Ur uncovered two particularly well-preserved educational buildings, designated as Numbers 1 and 7 Quiet Street, based on their location in the site grid. These structures demonstrated architectural planning specifically designed to support educational activities rather than domestic living. The buildings featured unusually thick walls, averaging 60 centimeters compared to the 40 centimeter standard for residential construction. This additional mass provided thermal insulation that moderated interior temperatures during the extreme heat of Mesopotamian summers and the cold of winter nights, creating more comfortable conditions for extended periods of sedentary study. The window placement within these structures showed careful consideration of natural lighting requirements for detailed work. High, clear-story windows positioned along the southern walls admitted indirect sunlight that illuminated classroom spaces throughout the day, without creating harsh glare that would strain students' eyes during close work with small cuneiform signs. The windows measured approximately 40 centimeters square and were positioned 2.5 meters above floor level, high enough to prevent distraction from external activities while providing optimal light distribution. The ventilation system incorporated into these buildings demonstrated sophisticated understanding of air circulation principles. Cross-ventilation was achieved through strategically placed openings that created airflow patterns drawing cool air from shaded northern exposures through the interior spaces and exhausting warm air through southern vents. During excavation, Woolley noted the presence of ceramic ventilation pipes embedded within the walls at regular intervals, creating passive air circulation that would have been particularly important during long hours of concentrated mental work. The acoustic properties of these educational spaces revealed attention to sound management that enhanced instructional effectiveness. The thick walls and compact floor plans created intimate acoustic environments where instructors speaking at normal volume could be clearly heard by all students without shouting. The mud brick construction absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, preventing the echo and reverberation that would make speech difficult to understand in larger stone structures. Modern acoustic analysis of reconstructed models based on Woolley's architectural documentation confirms that these spaces achieved acoustic conditions comparable to purpose-built modern classrooms. The interior organization of space within these buildings reflected multiple instructional modes. The main classroom area occupied approximately 60% of the total floor space, while smaller adjoining rooms provided spaces for individual tutoring, examination, or administrative functions. The classroom configuration allowed for whole group instruction with all students visible to the teacher, small group work with students clustered around senior pupils, and individual practice with students working independently at their benches. Storage facilities within these structures demonstrated systematic organization of educational materials. Built-in niches along the walls provided shelving for tablet collections, with different shelves designated for reference texts, student exercises, and administrative records. The positioning of these storage areas kept reference materials accessible, while preventing clutter in the active workspace. Archaeological evidence reveals that some niches contain tablets wrapped in cloth or stored in ceramic vessels, indicating preservation procedures designed to protect important texts from damage. The entrance configurations of these educational buildings reflected security and supervision concerns. Main entrances positioned to provide direct sightlines from the instructor's platform allowed teachers to monitor arrivals and departures. Some structures included secondary entrances that may have served as separate entry points for instructors and students, maintaining appropriate hierarchical distinctions. The doorways measured slightly narrower than standard domestic entrances, potentially to control traffic flow and prevent disruptive entries during instruction periods. Archaeological evidence from these structures includes not only tablets, but also the physical tools of education. Excavations uncovered clay recycling facilities consisting of large ceramic vessels where old tablets were soaked to dissolve the clay, filtering screens for removing impurities, and settling basins where clean clay was collected for reuse. The presence of these facilities within or immediately adjacent to school buildings confirms that tablet manufacture and recycling occurred on site as integral parts of the educational process. The Sumerian educational curriculum, preserved in thousands of exercise tablets from multiple sites, reveals a systematic progression of learning that moves students from basic literacy through increasingly complex subject matter with remarkable pedagogical sophistication. Tablet collections from Nippur, housed in the University Museum, contain complete sets of curricular materials that demonstrate standardized lesson sequences used across different schools and time periods. The curriculum began with sign lists teaching the basic cuneiform characters, progressed through vocabulary building exercises, advanced to grammar and syntax instruction, and culminated in the study of literary, mathematical, and administrative texts. The foundational level of Sumerian education focused on mastering the cuneiform writing system through systematic study of sign lists, organized according to pedagogical rather than linguistic principles. Students began with the simplest signs requiring the fewest wedge impressions, progressing gradually to more complex characters. The most basic exercises consisted of single signs, repeated multiple times across a tablet face, with each repetition showing incremental improvement as the student developed motor control and spatial judgment. Analysis of thousands of elementary exercise tablets reveals a carefully sequenced introduction of new signs that built upon previously learned forms. Students first mastered vertical and horizontal wedges, then angular combinations, and finally complex signs incorporating multiple elements. The progression followed patterns that modern pedagogical research recognizes as optimal for skill acquisition, introducing new information at rates that challenge students without overwhelming cognitive capacity. The vocabulary stage of instruction introduced students to Sumerian lexicon through thematic word lists that organized terms according to semantic categories. These lists, which would eventually be compiled into the comprehensive lexical series known as Urura equals Hubulu, presented related terms in systematic arrangements that facilitated memory retention and conceptual understanding. Students studied lists of wooden objects, then lists of plants, followed by animals, geographic features, food items, and professional titles. Building comprehensive vocabulary knowledge through structured categorical learning. Each vocabulary list followed standardized formats that presented Sumerian terms with Akkadian translations when Sumerian ceased to be spoken as a native language. This bilingual presentation created additional pedagogical benefits by requiring students to master both languages simultaneously. Exercise tablets show students copying these lists repeatedly, with progressively fewer errors indicating gradual memorization and internalization of vocabulary. The grammar instruction phase introduced students to morphology and syntax through the study of grammatical paradigms and model sentences. Tablets preserve conjugation exercises showing all forms of common verbs, declension tables demonstrating noun and adjective inflections, and syntax patterns illustrating proper word order and clause construction. The grammatical instruction emphasized pattern recognition and systematic rule application rather than rote memorization, developing analytical capabilities alongside linguistic knowledge. Literary education formed the culminating phase of the standard curriculum, introducing students to canonical compositions that represented the cultural and religious heritage of Mesopotamian civilization. Students copied hymns to deities, mythological narratives, wisdom literature, and royal inscriptions that served both as advanced language exercises and as vehicles for transmitting cultural values. The selection of literary texts for educational purposes showed careful attention to appropriate complexity levels, with shorter hymns studied before lengthy epics and simple narratives preceding complex mythological compositions. Mathematical training ran parallel to literary education throughout the curriculum, beginning with simple counting exercises and progressing to advanced calculation techniques. The earliest mathematical exercises consisted of number writing practice, with students copying sequences of numerals to develop familiarity with the sexagesimal system. Progression to calculation exercises introduced addition and subtraction through practical problems involving measures and weights that connected abstract mathematical concepts to concrete applications. Multiplication instruction utilized extensive tables that students memorized through repetitive copying. These tables, which presented products for numbers 1 through 20 and select larger values, served as reference tools for complex calculations. The memorization of multiplication tables represented a substantial cognitive achievement, requiring students to retain thousands of number combinations. Exercise tablets show students copying these tables dozens of times, with gradual improvement in accuracy and speed indicating successful memorization. Division, square roots, and geometric calculations formed the advanced mathematics curriculum, typically studied only by students pursuing specialized scribal careers. These advanced techniques required understanding of abstract mathematical relationships and sophisticated problem-solving strategies. Exercise problems preserved on tablets demonstrate that students learned these advanced techniques through worked examples showing complete solution procedures, allowing them to internalize mathematical reasoning processes. The professional teaching class that staffed Sumerian schools constituted a sophisticated educational hierarchy with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and career progression pathways. Cuneiform texts from the Old Babylonian period describe the Ummiyah, or master scribe, who served as school director and senior instructor, supported by specialized teachers called Ada Aduba, who focused on particular subject areas. Administrative tablets from Ur provide details about teacher training requirements, certification procedures, and compensation structures that reveal teaching had become a professionalized occupation with standardized qualifications and career advancement opportunities. The Ummiyah occupied the apex of the educational hierarchy, combining administrative authority over school operations with responsibility for advanced instruction in specialized subjects. Administrative texts indicate that individuals achieved Ummiyah status only after decades of experience as practicing scribes and junior instructors. The position required demonstrated mastery of the complete curriculum, proven teaching effectiveness, and recognition from the broader scribal community. The Ummiyah controlled student admissions, determined curriculum implementation, supervised junior instructors, and represented the school in dealings with temple or palace authorities who often sponsored educational institutions. Documentary evidence reveals that Ummiyah received substantial compensation, reflecting their expertise and authority. Administrative records from Ur show that master scribes received land allocations, grain rations, and cash payments that placed them among the economic elite of Mesopotamian society. Some Ummiyah accumulated sufficient wealth to construct substantial houses and support extended families, indicating that educational leadership provided pathways to significant social advancement. The Ada Aduba, or father of the tablet house, served as assistant instructors who conducted much of the day-to-day classroom teaching under Ummiyah supervision. These teachers specialized in particular curriculum areas, with some focusing on literacy instruction, others on mathematics, and still others on specialized technical subjects. The division of instructional labor allowed for expertise development in specific domains, while ensuring that students received instruction from teachers with deep knowledge of each subject area. Teacher training for Ada Aduba positions involved extended apprenticeships under experienced instructors. Aspiring teachers first completed the standard scribal curriculum, then continued their studies under Ummiyah guidance while simultaneously assuming instructional responsibilities for beginning students. This apprenticeship model allowed prospective teachers to develop pedagogical skills through supervised practice while continuing their own advanced studies. The duration of teacher training varied based on individual aptitude and the master's assessment of readiness, but typically extended for several years beyond completion of basic scribal education. Compensation for Ada Iduba, while less substantial than that received by Umia, nonetheless provided adequate support for professional teaching careers. Administrative documents record regular payments in silver, barley, and occasionally manufactured goods that allowed assistant teachers to maintain households and support families. The economic security provided by teaching positions made them attractive career options for individuals who had invested years in acquiring scribal education but lacked the family connections or capital to establish independent scribal practices. The educational hierarchy also included a category of advanced students called Big Brothers, who assisted with instruction of junior students while completing their own advanced studies. This tutorial system provided additional instructional capacity while giving advanced students valuable teaching experience. The Big Brothers helped beginners with basic exercises, corrected simple errors, and maintained classroom discipline, freeing senior instructors to focus on advanced instruction and curriculum development. Administrative texts indicate that successful Big Brothers often transitioned into formal assistant teaching positions, creating career pathways that began within the educational system itself. Literary texts from ancient Mesopotamia preserve vivid descriptions of daily student life within the Iduba that reveal both the rigor and humanity of Sumerian education. A composition known as School Days, preserved on tablets from Nippur, describes a student's routine beginning before dawn, hurrying to school to avoid tardiness penalties, spending long hours copying exercises under strict supervision, facing corporal punishment for errors or misbehavior, and returning home exhausted to prepare for the next day. The text provides specific details about classroom discipline, peer relationships, teacher-student interactions, and parental involvement that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of educational psychology. The School Days composition begins with the student awakening early and eating a simple breakfast of bread before leaving for school. The text emphasizes the anxiety associated with potential tardiness, noting that late arrival brought punishment from the gatekeeper who controlled access to the school building. This detail reveals that schools maintained formal attendance monitoring systems with designated personnel responsible for tracking student arrivals. The punishment for tardiness involved caning, a corporal discipline method applied throughout the Mesopotamian educational system. Upon arriving at school, the student recited his previous assignment to the Umia and received permission to begin copying his new assignment. The text describes the student preparing a fresh clay tablet, carefully forming it to appropriate size and thickness, and smoothing its surface to create an optimal writing surface. The tablet preparation process itself required skill developed through practice, as tablets needed sufficient thickness to prevent breaking while maintaining surfaces smooth enough for precise cuneiform impressions. The classroom routine described in School Days consisted primarily of copying exercises under close instructor supervision. Students worked individually at their benches, referring to model tablets that displayed the text to be copied. The composition describes the challenge of producing accurate copies, noting the difficulty of matching the model's sign forms and maintaining proper spacing. The text reveals that instructors circulated among students, examining their work and providing corrections. This individual attention ensured that errors were identified and corrected promptly, preventing students from reinforcing incorrect techniques through continued practice. Discipline within the classroom extended beyond punishment for tardiness to include penalties for various infractions. The School Days text describes beatings administered for standing without permission, speaking without permission, leaving school grounds without permission, and producing sloppy work. The frequency and variety of punishable offences described in the text indicates that schools maintained strict behavioural codes designed to create orderly learning environments. The use of corporal punishment, while troubling to modern sensibilities, reflected broader cultural attitudes toward child-rearing and education that emphasised discipline as essential for character formation. The composition also describes positive aspects of school life, including friendship among students and opportunities for recognition. The text mentions students helping each other with difficult assignments and sharing meals during break periods. These details reveal that despite the authoritarian instructional environment, students formed supportive peer relationships that made the educational experience more bearable. The text also describes the pride students felt when producing especially good work that earned instructor praise, indicating that recognition for achievement served as positive motivation alongside punishment for failure. Parental involvement in education emerges as a significant theme in the school days narrative. The composition describes the student's father inviting the Ummiyah to the family home for a meal, plying him with food and drink, presenting him with gifts including a new garment, and placing a ring on his finger. Following this generous treatment, the Ummiyah pronounces the student talented and destined for success. This episode reveals that parental lobbying of instructors occurred in ancient Mesopotamia just as in modern educational contexts, with families seeking to improve their children's educational outcomes through cultivation of positive teacher relationships. The text concludes with the Ummiyah's blessing, predicting that the student will become a successful scribe who brings honour to his family. This optimistic ending provides insight into the aspirations that motivated families to invest in scribal education, despite its costs and difficulties. The promise of professional success, social advancement, and family honour justified the years of demanding study and the financial sacrifices required to support a child through the educational system. The foundation of Sumerian literacy education rested upon extensive lexical lists that systematically organised vocabulary according to semantic and thematic categories with precision that reveals advanced linguistic analysis capabilities. These lists, transmitted across generations with remarkable consistency, represent humanity's earliest documented attempts at systematic knowledge organisation and taxonomic classification. The most comprehensive example, known as the Urura equals Hubulu series, eventually grew to encompass 24 tablets containing thousands of entries organised into categories including wooden objects, plants, animals, geographic features, food items, and professional titles. The earliest lexical lists date to the late 4th millennium BC, preceding even the full development of narrative cuneiform writing. These proto-literate lists from Uruk demonstrate that systematic vocabulary organisation emerged as a foundational element of writing itself rather than as a later pedagogical innovation. The archaic lists contained hundreds of entries arranged in functional categories that reflected administrative and economic priorities of early urban civilization. Lists of grain types, livestock categories, pottery forms, and textile products reveal that literacy initially developed to serve bureaucratic record-keeping needs, with educational applications emerging as secondary functions. The evolution of lexical lists across the 3rd millennium BC shows progressive refinement of organizational principles and expanding scope of coverage. Early dynastic period lists from Farah and Abu Salabik demonstrate increasing sophistication in categorical subdivisions and hierarchical structuring. The list began to incorporate not only concrete nouns denoting physical objects, but also abstract concepts, verbal forms, and grammatical particles. This expansion transformed the lists from simple administrative vocabularies into comprehensive linguistic references that documented the full complexity of the Sumerian language. The Urura equals Hubulu series represents the culmination of 2,000 years of lexical list development, achieving a level of comprehensiveness and systematic organisation that would not be matched until modern dictionary compilation. The series title derives from its opening entry, Urura, the Sumerian word for debt or loan, paired with its Akkadian translation Hubulu. The choice to organise this massive lexical compilation beginning with financial terminology reflects the continued importance of economic administration in Mesopotamian civilization and the origins of writing in commercial record-keeping. The 24 tablets of Urura equals Hubulu contain approximately 10,000 entries distributed across thematic sections that display sophisticated taxonomic thinking. The first tablet addresses trees and wooden objects, beginning with types of trees, progressing through wooden implements, furniture, vehicles, and musical instruments. The organisation within each category proceeds from general to specific, with major types subdivided into varieties distinguished by size, quality, function, or origin. This hierarchical structuring demonstrates understanding of biological and functional relationships that anticipates modern classification systems. Subsequent tablets systematically cover the material world with similar thoroughness. Tablet 2 catalogues reed and reed products, essential materials in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. Tablet 3 addresses pottery vessels organized by size, shape, and function. Tablets 4 through 7 comprehensively document plants including agricultural crops, garden vegetables, herbs, and wild plants. The botanical taxonomy revealed in these tablets shows detailed observation of plant characteristics and sophisticated understanding of plant relationships. Modern botanists examining these ancient lists have confirmed that the Sumerian classifications often correspond closely to modern taxonomic groupings based on genetic relationships. The animal sections of Arura equals Hubulu occupy tablets 8 through 13, documenting domestic livestock, wild animals, birds, fish, and insects with remarkable detail. The livestock sections distinguish varieties by age, sex, colour, and breeding status, reflecting the importance of animal husbandry in Mesopotamian economy. Wild animal entries include habitat information and behavioural characteristics, indicating that the lexical tradition incorporated observational natural history alongside simple naming. The fish and bird sections demonstrate particular sophistication, with entries organised according to what modern biologists recognise as valid taxonomic distinctions based on anatomical features and ecological niches. Geographic terminology occupies tablets 14 through 16, cataloguing types of terrain, water features, agricultural land categories, and architectural structures. The sophistication of geographic vocabulary reveals highly developed conceptual frameworks for understanding landscape and built environment. Distinctions among field types based on soil quality, irrigation status, and crop suitability demonstrate agricultural expertise. Architectural vocabulary distinguishes building types by function, construction materials, and social status of occupants, providing invaluable evidence for understanding Mesopotamian urban planning and social organization. The final tablets of the series address minerals, metals, textiles, food products, and professional titles. The metallurgical vocabulary documents sophisticated understanding of metal properties, alloy compositions, and manufacturing techniques. Terms distinguish copper, bronze, silver, gold, iron, and lead, with further subdivisions identifying specific alloys and quality grades. Textile terminology reflects the importance of cloth production in Mesopotamian economy, with hundreds of terms distinguishing fabric types by fibre source, weave pattern, colour, and intended use. The transmission of lexical lists across centuries and geographical distances demonstrates remarkable textual stability that indicates conscious preservation efforts. Comparison of Urura equals Hubulu tablets from sites separated by hundreds of years shows nearly identical content and organization, with variations limited to minor spelling differences or occasional additional entries. This stability could only result from careful copying procedures and systematic quality control during transmission. Schools used master copies of lexical lists as reference standards, ensuring that student copies maintained accuracy across multiple copying generations. The pedagogical function of lexical lists extended beyond simple vocabulary instruction to encompass broader educational objectives. The thematic organization provided frameworks for conceptual understanding, teaching students to recognize categorical relationships and hierarchical structures. The bilingual presentation in later periods developed multilingual competency, essential for administrative careers in the increasingly cosmopolitan ancient Near East. The encyclopedic scope exposed students to comprehensive knowledge of the material world, natural phenomena, and social organization that constituted educated understanding in Mesopotamian civilization. Sumerian mathematical education demonstrates teaching methodologies and conceptual frameworks that anticipate modern mathematics pedagogy by thousands of years. Mathematical tablets from Nippur and other sites reveal a carefully sequenced curriculum that introduced numerical concepts through concrete examples before progressing to abstract calculations. Students began with counting exercises using real objects, advanced to addition and subtraction through practical problems involving measures and weights, progressed to multiplication using sophisticated table systems, and ultimately mastered advanced techniques including division, square roots, and geometric calculations. The earliest mathematical instruction focused on developing number sense through manipulation of physical objects. Archaeological evidence from school context includes collections of small clay tokens and counting stones that served as teaching aids for basic arithmetic. Students learned to associate numerical symbols with specific quantities, by grouping and regrouping these physical counters. This concrete approach established foundational understanding of numerical relationships before introducing abstract symbolic manipulation. The progression to written arithmetic began with copying numerical symbols and simple number sequences. Exercise tablets show students writing progressively larger numbers, developing familiarity with the sexagesimal place value notation through repetitive practice. The writing exercises incorporated numerical patterns that highlighted mathematical relationships, such as sequences showing regular increments or geometric progressions. These patterned exercises developed both writing proficiency and mathematical intuition simultaneously. Addition and subtraction instruction utilized word problems based on practical scenarios that students could visualize and understand. Exercise problems describe transactions involving measures of grain, weights of metal, or lengths of time, requiring students to calculate totals, differences, or remaining quantities. The problems incorporated realistic numbers and situations drawn from everyday commercial and agricultural activities. This contextualization made abstract operations meaningful by connecting them to familiar experiences, while simultaneously teaching students to apply mathematical skills to practical problem solving. The measurement problems that dominated early arithmetic instruction familiarized students with the complex Mesopotamian system of weights and measures. Different units applied to different commodities, with grain measured in gur, silla, and ban, while wool used mina and shekel, and length employed kush and nindan. Conversion between units required understanding of ratios and proportional relationships. The arithmetic curriculum systematically taught these conversion factors through problems requiring students to express quantities in different units, developing proportional reasoning alongside basic calculation skills. Multiplication instruction represented a major curriculum milestone, introducing students to one of mathematics' most powerful operations. Rather than teaching multiplication through repeated addition or abstract algorithms, Sumerian mathematics instruction utilized extensive multiplication tables that students memorized through repetitive copying. These tables, which presented products for standard multipliers from 1 through 20 and select larger values, served as reference tools that students internalized through practice. The multiplication table tablets follow standardized formats that facilitated systematic memorization. Each table presents products for a single multiplier, arranged in ascending order of the multiplicand. Students copied these tables repeatedly until they could reproduce them from memory. The pedagogical effectiveness of this approach derived from the systematic organization and the rhythmic patterns created by the sexagesimal number system. The regular relationships among products made memorization more efficient than rote learning of arbitrary associations. Advanced multiplication instruction introduced techniques for calculating products beyond the scope of memorized tables. These techniques utilize the distributive property of multiplication, breaking complex calculations into manageable components. For example, to multiply 43 by 17, students learn to decompose the problem into 40 times 17 plus 3 times 17, using memorized table values for the simpler components. This method required understanding of numerical decomposition and the mathematical properties that make such decomposition valid. Division instruction built upon multiplication knowledge by teaching students to recognize division as the inverse of multiplication. Rather than developing independent division algorithms, Sumerian mathematics treated division problems as questions about what multiplier produces a given product. Students learned to solve division problems by searching through multiplication tables for entries matching the dividend, with the corresponding multiplier providing the quotient. This approach reinforced understanding of the reciprocal relationship between multiplication and division, while leveraging already memorized multiplication facts. For divisions yielding non-integer results, Sumerian mathematics employed reciprocal tables that listed fractions expressed as unit fractions with sexagesimal denominators. Students learned that dividing by a number equaled multiplying by its reciprocal, transforming division problems into multiplication calculations. The reciprocal tables, which students memorized alongside multiplication tables, provided the necessary conversion factors. This elegant approach unified division and multiplication within a single conceptual framework based on table lookup and multiplication. Square root calculations represented one of the most advanced topics in the standard mathematical curriculum. Babylonian mathematical tablets preserve sophisticated techniques for approximating square roots to high precision, using iterative methods that anticipate Newton's method by millennia. Students learn these techniques through worked examples showing complete calculation procedures. The pedagogical approach emphasized understanding the logic of approximation refinement rather than merely memorizing procedural steps. Geometric calculations formed another advanced mathematics domain, with students learning to calculate areas, volumes, and dimensions of various shapes. The curriculum included formulas for rectangles, triangles, circles, and three-dimensional solids, including cylinders and pyramids. Some formulas showed approximations, such as the use of 3 as the value of pi, while others achieved exact results. The geometric instruction connected abstract mathematical relationships to practical applications in land surveying, construction, and volume measurement for agricultural storage. Problem texts preserved on mathematical tablets reveal sophisticated pedagogical strategies designed to develop mathematical reasoning beyond rote calculation. Many problems incorporated unnecessary information that students needed to identify and disregard, teaching discrimination between relevant and irrelevant data. Other problems required multiple calculation steps performed in proper sequence, developing procedural planning capabilities. The most advanced problems demanded recognition of mathematical relationships not explicitly stated in the problem text, cultivating mathematical insight and creative problem-solving abilities. The Sumerian sexagesimal numerical system, based on the number 60, represents one of humanity's most sophisticated mathematical innovations, and its transmission through formal education ensured its preservation and refinement across millennia. Archaeological evidence reveals that teaching the base 60 system required specialized pedagogical techniques that helped students master conceptually complex calculations. Exercise tablets show how instructors broke down sexagesimal operations into manageable steps, using concrete analogies and practical applications to build understanding. The system's complexity demanded systematic instruction that could only be achieved through formal educational institutions. The choice of 60 as a numerical base derives from its exceptional mathematical properties, particularly its divisibility by many factors, including 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This rich factor structure simplified fraction calculations and division operations, making 60 superior to 10 as a mathematical foundation for practical calculations. The Sumerians apparently recognized these advantages and developed a complete numerical system exploiting them. The sexagesimal system employed a place value notation, where the position of a numeral determined its value, with each position representing a power of 60. This conceptual sophistication parallels modern decimal place value notation and required similar levels of abstract thinking to master. Students needed to understand that the same symbol represented different quantities depending on its position, with rightmost positions representing units, the next position representing 60s, the next representing 3600s, and so forth. Teaching place value concepts presented significant pedagogical challenges, as the abstraction involved exceeds that of simple counting or even basic arithmetic. Mesopotamian mathematics educators developed concrete teaching tools to make place value comprehensible. Archaeological evidence includes marked counting boards and abacus-like devices that physically represented different place values through spatial separation. Students learned to manipulate counters in different columns representing different powers of 60, building intuitive understanding of place value through physical experience before working with abstract symbolic notation. The sexagesimal system incorporated 2 separate sets of symbols representing numbers 1 through 9 and tens from 10 through 50. These symbols combined additively within each position to represent values from 1 to 59. For example, the symbol for 40 combined with the symbol for 7 represented 47. Students learned these within-position combinations through systematic practice, copying number sequences that demonstrated all possible combinations. The absence of a 0 symbol in early Sumerian mathematics created potential ambiguities in place value notation, as nothing marked empty positions. A number like 3601 looked identical to 61 without contextual clues, indicating the presence of an empty 60s position. Students learn to resolve these ambiguities through contextual understanding and problem-checking procedures. The later Babylonian innovation of a placeholder symbol, marking empty positions, addressed this limitation, though the placeholder functioned differently from the modern zero concept. Conversion between sexagesimal notation and practical measurement units required additional skills that students developed through extensive practice. Real-world quantities often employed mixed bases, with some units subdividing into sixties, while others used tens, 12s, or other factors. Students learned conversion procedures specific to each measurement system, memorizing the relationships between units and practicing conversion calculations until they became automatic. The multiplication and division algorithms adapted to sexagesimal notation utilize the same basic table lookup strategies employed in simpler calculations, but required additional attention to place value management. When multiplying two multi-place numbers, students calculated partial products for each place value combination, then combined results with appropriate place value adjustments. Exercise tablets show worked examples demonstrating these procedures in detail, with each step explicitly calculated and the place value shifts clearly indicated. Advanced sexagesimal calculations involve sophisticated techniques for managing the complexity of multi-place arithmetic. Reciprocal tables extended to include sexagesimal fractions, enabling division calculations with fractional divisors. Square root approximations utilize sexagesimal fractions to express results to high precision. The curriculum developed these advanced skills through graduated problem sequences that progressively increased difficulty while maintaining support through worked examples and teacher guidance. The astronomical applications of sexagesimal mathematics provided compelling demonstrations of the system's power and utility. Babylonian astronomers utilized sexagesimal notation to record celestial observations with precision, enabling accurate prediction of planetary positions and eclipse timing. Students studying advanced mathematics encountered astronomical problems that showcase sexagesimal calculation capabilities while connecting mathematical learning to impressive practical achievements. The prestige associated with astronomical prediction enhanced student motivation to master the challenging sexagesimal system. The global legacy of Mesopotamian sexagesimal mathematics persists in modern time measurement and angular notation, with 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. This enduring influence testifies to both the mathematical elegance of the sexagesimal system and the effectiveness of Mesopotamian educational institutions in preserving and transmitting sophisticated technical knowledge across thousands of years. Advanced Sumerian students studied a canon of literary works that served both cultural and pedagogical purposes, transmitting religious knowledge, historical traditions, and moral values while developing sophisticated language skills. The literary curriculum included mythological narratives, hymns to deities, royal inscriptions, wisdom literature, and epic compositions that constituted Mesopotamia's classical literary heritage. Tablet collections reveal that students copied these texts repeatedly, gradually progressing from short excerpts to complete compositions as their skills developed. The selection of literary works for educational purposes shows conscious pedagogical planning that balanced cultural transmission with skill development. The literary curriculum began with short hymns and proverbs that introduced students to elevated literary language while remaining accessible to those with limited experience. These introductory texts typically range from 10 to 30 lines in length, short enough to be copied in single classroom sessions, while long enough to present complete thoughts and coherent structures. The hymns addressed major deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, familiarizing students with religious concepts and theological terminology while developing literary copying skills. Proverb collections served particularly important pedagogical functions by combining literary instruction with moral education. The proverbs presented observations about human nature, social relationships, and practical wisdom in memorable formulations that students could easily retain. Copying and memorizing proverbs developed language skills while simultaneously inculcating cultural values regarding proper behavior, work ethic, family relationships, and social hierarchy. The dual function made proverbs ideal curriculum materials that advanced multiple educational objectives simultaneously. As students progressed, they encountered increasingly lengthy and complex compositions that challenged their developing skills. The Sumerian literary canon included numerous mythological narratives describing the activities of gods, the creation of the world, and the establishment of civilized order. These narratives transmitted religious knowledge essential for understanding Mesopotamian culture, while providing texts of sufficient length and complexity to develop advanced literacy skills. The myth of Enki and Ninmah exemplifies the type of mythological narrative utilized in intermediate literary education. This composition describes the creation of humanity through a contest between the gods Enki and Ninmah, each attempting to create beings the other cannot assign proper social roles. The narrative addresses theological questions about human diversity and social hierarchy, while incorporating humor and dramatic tension that maintained student interest. The text's moderate length of approximately 120 lines made it manageable for students who had mastered basic literary forms but not yet ready for epic-length compositions. Royal inscriptions constituted another important category of literary curriculum materials. These texts, which commemorated royal building projects, military campaigns, and administrative achievements, familiarized students with historical traditions and political ideology while developing the formal writing styles used in official contexts. Students destined for administrative careers particularly needed mastery of royal inscription conventions, as their future work might involve composing similar texts for contemporary rulers. The hymns of Shulgi, ruler of the Ur III Empire around 2100 BC, received particular attention in literary education curricula. These compositions present the king describing his own exceptional abilities, including his legendary running prowess and his mastery of scribal arts. The hymns claim that Shulgi himself attended the Aduba and achieved scribal expertise, making him a role model for students pursuing scribal careers. The educational use of these texts created aspirational examples while teaching advanced literary techniques. Epic poetry represented the pinnacle of literary education, with compositions like the Epic of Gilgamesh studied by the most advanced students. These lengthy, complex narratives demanded sophisticated reading comprehension and advanced writing skills to copy accurately. The epics incorporated the full range of Sumerian literary techniques, including dialogue, description, metaphor, and complex narrative structures. Mastering these texts demonstrated achievement of the highest levels of literary competency. The pedagogical progression through literary texts followed carefully designed sequences that gradually increased linguistic complexity, narrative sophistication, and thematic depth. This scaffolded approach enabled students to develop skills systematically while maintaining appropriate challenge levels. The curriculum designers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how literary competency develops through graduated exposure to increasingly demanding texts. Memorization played a crucial role in literary education, with students expected to internalize complete compositions through repetitive copying and recitation. This emphasis on memorization served multiple purposes beyond simple text preservation. The internalized texts provided models of proper grammar, style, and composition that students could draw upon in their own writing. Memorized literary passages also served as cultural capital, marking educated individuals through their ability to quote classical compositions in appropriate contexts. The literary curriculum incorporated not only passive copying but also active compositional exercises that required students to demonstrate creative application of learned literary techniques. Advanced students composed original hymns, prayers, or narrative passages in imitation of classical models. These compositional exercises developed creative abilities while reinforcing understanding of literary conventions and stylistic norms. Sumerian schools employed formal assessment procedures that evaluated student progress through written examinations, oral recitations, and practical demonstrations of acquired skills. Administrative texts describe examination protocols that required students to write specific compositions from memory, solve mathematical problems without reference materials, and demonstrate mastery of technical procedures under instructor supervision. The examination system included multiple assessment points throughout a student's education, with successful completion of each level required before advancement to more advanced study. This systematic approach to evaluation reveals sophisticated understanding of assessment's role in learning. The examination procedures documented in administrative texts indicate that assessments occurred at regular intervals marking completion of curriculum stages. Students faced examinations after mastering basic sign writing, completing vocabulary instruction, finishing grammar studies, and demonstrating literary competency. Each examination tested the specific skills and knowledge associated with the completed curriculum stage, ensuring that students had achieved minimum competency standards before advancing to more demanding material. Written examinations required students to produce specified texts from memory without reference to models. The examination conditions included instructor supervision to prevent cheating and time limits that required efficient work. Students who successfully reproduced assigned texts with acceptable accuracy and proper orthography demonstrated readiness for advancement. Those whose examination tablets contained excessive errors or demonstrated inadequate mastery faced additional practice requirements before retesting. The evaluation criteria applied to examination tablets extended beyond simple accuracy to encompass aesthetic qualities of handwriting and tablet production. Students needed to demonstrate proper clay preparation, appropriate tablet sizing and shaping, neat sign formation, consistent line spacing, and overall aesthetic presentation. These technical skills marked professional competency as much as knowledge of text content, so their inclusion in assessment procedures ensured comprehensive evaluation of scribal abilities. Oral examination components tested memorization and recitation skills essential for ancient literate culture. Students recited memorized compositions before panels of instructors who evaluated accuracy, proper pronunciation, and effective delivery. The ability to recite lengthy compositions from memory demonstrated the mental discipline and memory capacity that Mesopotamian culture valued highly. Success in oral examinations confirmed that students had internalized textual knowledge rather than merely developing mechanical copying abilities. Mathematical examinations required students to solve problems, demonstrating computational skills and conceptual understanding. The problems presented situations requiring multi-step solutions that tested not only calculation accuracy, but also problem-solving strategies and mathematical reasoning. Students needed to show their solution procedures, allowing examiners to identify conceptual errors versus simple computational mistakes. This diagnostic approach enabled targeted remediation for students whose errors revealed specific misunderstandings. Practical examinations tested technical skills required for professional scribal work. Students demonstrated tablet preparation techniques, including clay sourcing, kneading, forming, and surface finishing. They showed competency with writing instruments, producing styluses from reed and maintaining them in proper condition. They exhibited knowledge of clay recycling procedures, chemical preservation techniques, and tablet storage methods. These practical skills assessments ensured that graduates possessed comprehensive technical capabilities necessary for independent scribal practice. The examination system incorporated graduated difficulty levels that matched assessment demands to curriculum stages. Early examinations tested basic competencies with relatively simple requirements, while advanced assessments demanded sophisticated performances. This graduated approach maintained appropriate challenge levels throughout education, while providing clear progression markers that motivated student effort. Success rates on examinations influenced student advancement and career prospects. Students who consistently performed well on assessments gained recognition as promising scribes deserving of advanced training opportunities. Those who struggled faced remediation requirements or redirection toward less demanding career paths. The examination system thus served selection functions, channeling students toward careers matching their demonstrated abilities. The social significance of examination success extended beyond individual students to affect family status and economic prospects. Families invested substantial resources in scribal education, expecting returns through advantageous career placement. Examination results that confirmed adequate progress justified continued investment, while poor performance raised questions about whether resources should continue flowing toward educational pursuits. The high stakes increased examination stress, but also motivated serious preparation efforts. The completion of scribal education marked by formal graduation ceremonies that conferred professional status and authorized practice of the scribal profession. Texts describe elaborate ceremonies where successful students received symbolic objects representing their new status, participated in ritual purification procedures, and took oaths regarding their professional responsibilities. The graduation process included evaluation by panels of senior scribes who assessed candidates' competency across multiple domains before granting certification. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes reveals that these ceremonies took place in sacred spaces, emphasizing the religious and social significance of scribal graduation. The graduation ceremonies represented culminating events in educational careers that typically spanned 8 to 12 years, depending on the level of specialization pursued. Administrative texts from Ur describe graduation procedures occurring during spring months, coinciding with the Akitu festival that celebrated cosmic renewal and the establishment of divine order. This timing connected individual scribal achievement with broader cosmic and social order, positioning newly certified scribes as agents maintaining civilization itself. The ceremonies began with ritual purification procedures that prepared graduates for their new professional status. Candidates bathed in sacred waters, donned clean linen garments, and underwent ritual anointing with precious oils. These purification rites paralleled those performed for priests entering temple service, emphasizing the sacred dimension of scribal work. The parallel reflected Mesopotamian understanding of writing as a divine gift, requiring proper spiritual preparation from those who would practice it. Following purification, candidates presented themselves before examination panels consisting of senior scribes from multiple institutions. The panels included the candidate's own umia, visiting masters from other schools, and representatives from temple or palace administrations that employed professional scribes. This multi-institutional evaluation ensured that certification standards maintained consistency across the broader scribal profession, rather than varying according to individual school standards. The panel examinations tested comprehensive mastery of the scribal arts through multiple assessment modes. Candidates wrote specified texts from memory, demonstrating both textual knowledge and calligraphic skill. They solved mathematical problems requiring complex multi-step calculations, showcasing computational abilities and mathematical reasoning. They translated between Sumerian and Akkadian, proving bilingual competency essential for administrative work. They identified obscure cuneiform signs and explained their uses, displaying expertise in the writing system's complexities. Beyond technical skills, the examinations assessed candidates' knowledge of professional ethics and responsibilities. Panel members questioned candidates about proper procedures for handling confidential documents, protocols for witnessing contracts, standards for archival preservation, and ethical obligations regarding truthful record-keeping. These questions emphasize that scribal work carried moral dimensions extending beyond mere technical competency. The profession required individuals of proven character who could be trusted with society's documentary infrastructure. Successful candidates received symbolic objects marking their new professional status. The most significant was the stylus, the fundamental tool of the scribal craft. Graduation styluses, crafted from precious materials including silver or imported hardwoods, rather than common reed, served as ceremonial objects representing scribal authority. Administrative texts indicate that some graduation styluses bore inscriptions identifying the recipient and commemorating the achievement, transforming them into permanent records of professional certification. Candidates also received clay seal cylinders carved with personal identifying imagery and cuneiform inscriptions stating their names and professional titles. These seals served practical functions in authenticating documents, but also symbolized the authority vested in certified scribes to create legally binding records. The imagery carved on graduation seals often incorporated symbols of Nisaba, the goddess of writing and grain, connecting the individual scribe's authority to divine sanction. The oath-taking ceremony represented the culmination of graduation proceedings. Candidates swore before the assembled witnesses to uphold professional standards, maintain confidentiality of sensitive information, execute their duties faithfully, and preserve the integrity of written records. The oaths invoked divine witnesses, calling upon Niseba and other deities to witness the commitments and enforce compliance through supernatural sanctions. The religious framing elevated professional obligations to sacred duties backed by cosmic authority. Following the formal oath-taking, graduation ceremonies concluded with celebratory feasts hosted by the graduates' families. These celebrations served social functions beyond mere festivity, establishing the graduates' new status within the community and creating networks of professional relationships. Family members invited senior scribes, potential employers, and influential community members whose presence honoured the graduate while creating opportunities for career advancement. The economic dimensions of graduation ceremonies were substantial. Families invested significant resources in providing appropriate garments, ceremonial objects, and feast provisions that reflected their social status and demonstrated proper respect for the achievement. The expenses represented culminating costs of educational investments that had consumed family resources for years. The willingness to bear these final costs despite their magnitude testified to the value Mesopotamian society placed on scribal education and certification. Beyond basic scribal education, Sumerian schools offered advanced specialized training in technical disciplines that required years of additional study under expert instruction. Students could pursue specialization in fields including divination, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, or legal administration, each requiring mastery of specialized knowledge and techniques. Tablet collections from Ur reveal the existence of advanced curricula for these specialized fields, with detailed instructional texts that preserve sophisticated technical knowledge. The specialization system demonstrates that Sumerian education extended far beyond basic literacy to encompass comprehensive professional training. The decision to pursue specialized training typically occurred after completion of basic scribal education and initial professional practice. Young scribes spent several years working in administrative positions where they gained practical experience while identifying fields matching their interests and aptitudes. This interim practical period served multiple purposes, allowing individuals to mature professionally, accumulate resources to fund advanced training, and make informed decisions about specialization based on actual career experience rather than youthful preferences. Access to specialized training required both demonstrated aptitude and significant financial resources. The advanced technical disciplines demanded instructors with rare expertise, whose services commanded premium compensation. Students pursuing specialized training typically needed family support or institutional sponsorship from temples or palaces, seeking to develop expertise in particular technical areas. The economic barriers meant that specialized training remained accessible primarily to individuals from wealthy families or those who secured patronage through exceptional ability. The organizational structures supporting specialized education differed from those of basic scribal schools. Rather than operating classroom-based instruction for groups of students, specialized training typically followed apprenticeship models where individual students studied under recognized masters. This personalized instruction reflected the advanced nature of the material and the individualized attention required for mastery of complex technical knowledge. The apprenticeship model also facilitated transmission of tacit knowledge and practical skills that could not be adequately conveyed through textual instruction alone. The duration of specialized training varied according to the field's complexity and the student's aptitude. Medical training typically required 5 to 7 years of intensive study and supervised practice before independent practice was authorized. Astronomical training demanded similar or longer periods given the mathematical sophistication and observational experience required. Legal specialization could be completed more quickly for students who focused narrowly on specific areas of practice. Though comprehensive legal expertise required extended study comparable to other specializations, specialized curricula combined theoretical instruction with practical application in carefully structured progressions. Students began with foundational theoretical knowledge, studying texts that explained underlying principles and established conceptual frameworks. They progressed to observational or practical work under close supervision, applying theoretical knowledge in controlled settings where errors could be identified and corrected. Finally, they assumed increasing responsibility for independent work, while master practitioners provided oversight and evaluation. The assessment procedures for specialized training emphasized demonstrated competency in realistic professional contexts rather than abstract examinations. Medical students treated actual patients under supervision, with their diagnostic accuracy and treatment effectiveness directly observable. Divination students interpreted actual omen cases with their predictions subject to verification through subsequent events. Astronomical students made observational predictions that celestial phenomena would confirm or refute. These performance-based assessments ensured that certification reflected genuine professional capability. The completion of specialized training conferred expert status that distinguished practitioners from general scribes. Specialized practitioners commanded higher compensation, enjoyed greater professional prestige, and gained access to elite social circles. The investment in specialized training thus yielded substantial returns for those who successfully completed it. However, the investment also carried risks, as failure to complete training or achieve certification meant years of effort and expense produced no credential and no clear career path. The institutional memory preserved through specialized training systems ensured continuity of technical expertise across generations. The apprenticeship model created direct transmission chains connecting contemporary practitioners to masters extending back centuries. This unbroken transmission preserved not only explicit knowledge documented in texts, but also tacit knowledge, practical tricks, and interpretive judgments that could only be learned through personal instruction and supervised practice. Training in hepatoscopy, the reading of sheep livers for divination purposes, required specialized education that combined anatomical knowledge, symbolic interpretation, and ritual procedures in a sophisticated technical curriculum. Divination schools operated as advanced educational institutions where students studied extensive omen collections, learned to identify anatomical features with divinatory significance, and practiced interpretation techniques under expert supervision. Archaeological discoveries at Mari uncovered model livers made from clay that served as teaching aids, marked with anatomical divisions and inscribed with interpretive guidelines. These teaching models demonstrate pedagogical innovation designed to facilitate complex technical training. Hepatoscopy represented the most prestigious and technically demanding form of Mesopotamian divination. The practice rested on the cosmological principle that divine will manifested in the natural world through signs observable to trained interpreters. The liver specifically served as the primary divinatory organ because Mesopotamian anatomical understanding identified it as the source of blood and therefore the seat of life itself. Divine messages inscribed on this vital organ were believed to provide authoritative guidance on questions of state policy, military strategy, and royal decision-making. The hepatoscopy curriculum began with systematic study of liver anatomy through direct observation of sheep livers obtained from temple sacrifices. Students learned to identify and distinguish the organ's major structural components, including the gallbladder, the bile duct, the caudate lobe, and various smaller anatomical features. The anatomical instruction emphasized recognition of normal structural patterns, establishing baseline knowledge necessary for identifying significant variations. Anatomical terminology formed a substantial portion of early hepatoscopy training. The Akkadian technical vocabulary for liver anatomy included dozens of precise terms distinguishing minute anatomical features. Students memorized this terminology through repetitive examination of actual livers, while instructors pointed out each named feature. The precision of anatomical vocabulary reflects the detailed observational requirements of professional hepatoscopy practice. Following basic anatomical instruction, students progressed to studying the interpretive significance assigned to various anatomical features and variations. The curriculum utilized extensive omen collections preserved on cuneiform tablets that documented thousands of liver configurations and their associated meanings. These collections represented centuries of accumulated divinatory experience organized into systematic reference works. Students copied these omen collections repeatedly, internalizing both the anatomical descriptions and their interpretive meanings. The omen text followed standardized formats that facilitated systematic study. Each entry described a specific anatomical configuration using technical terminology, then stated the divinatory interpretation associated with that configuration. The interpretations addressed questions typical of royal consultation, including military outcomes, agricultural prospects, political stability, and royal health. The systematic organization of omen collections according to anatomical features enabled students to develop comprehensive understanding of interpretive principles rather than merely memorizing isolated examples. The clay liver models discovered at Mari represent remarkable pedagogical innovations designed to support hepatoscopy training. These models, crafted to replicate sheep liver anatomy with considerable accuracy, served as permanent teaching aids that remained available for study regardless of the availability of actual organs. The models measured approximately 15 centimeters in length and displayed the major anatomical features with sufficient detail to support serious anatomical instruction. The pedagogical sophistication of the liver models appears most clearly in their inscriptions. The Mary models bear cuneiform inscriptions that label anatomical features using standard technical terminology. Some models include additional inscriptions describing divinatory interpretations associated with specific anatomical variations. These annotated teaching aids allowed students to study anatomy and interpretive principles simultaneously, creating integrated learning experiences that connected theoretical knowledge with practical application. Advanced hepatoscopy training emphasized interpretation of complex cases involving multiple simultaneous anomalies. Students learned hierarchical principles for weighing the significance of different features when they indicated conflicting outcomes. They studied procedures for synthesizing multiple indicators into coherent overall interpretations. They practiced verbalizing interpretations in appropriate language that conveyed divinatory findings to royal clients, with proper balance of authority and deference. The ritual dimensions of hepatoscopy received systematic instruction alongside technical knowledge. Students learned proper procedures for sacrificing the sheep, extracting the liver, and examining it under appropriate ritual conditions. The ritual instruction emphasized that divination required not only technical expertise, but also spiritual purity and proper relationship with divine powers. Students participated in actual divinatory rituals under master supervision, gradually assuming greater responsibility as their competency developed. The verification of divinatory predictions provided crucial feedback that refined interpretive skills. Students maintained records of their interpretations and the subsequent outcomes, creating empirical databases that tested their developing expertise. Systematic comparison of predictions against outcomes identified areas requiring interpretive adjustment and validated successful interpretive strategies. This empirical approach distinguished Mesopotamian divination from purely speculative mysticism, grounding practice in observable regularities. The professional prestige associated with hepatoscopy expertise derived from the practice's role in royal decision-making. Skilled diviners served as trusted advisors to kings, their interpretations influencing military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and domestic policies. This influence translated into substantial compensation, high social status, and proximity to power. The rewards justified the years of demanding study required to achieve professional competency. Sumerian medical schools trained physician scribes in diagnostic procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and surgical techniques through systematic instruction that combined theoretical knowledge with practical apprenticeship. Medical education tablets preserved curricula that taught anatomy through dissection studies, pharmacology through the identification and preparation of medicinal substances, and clinical procedures through supervised treatment of patients. The medical curriculum required students to memorize extensive symptom catalogues, learn complex pharmaceutical recipes, and demonstrate competency in diagnostic procedures before being authorized to practice independently. The sophistication of medical education reveals advanced understanding of knowledge transmission in technical fields. Medical education represented one of the most demanding specialized training paths available in ancient Mesopotamia. The curriculum encompassed multiple knowledge domains including human and animal anatomy, botanical and mineral pharmacology, surgical techniques, diagnostic procedures, and therapeutic principles. Mastery of this comprehensive body of knowledge required years of intensive study under expert instruction combined with extensive clinical experience. The anatomical component of medical training utilized both human and animal dissection to teach bodily structure and organ relationships. While religious and cultural constraints limited human dissection in many contexts, medical schools obtained bodies of executed criminals, unclaimed deceased, and individuals who donated their bodies for educational purposes. These human dissections provided direct observational knowledge of internal anatomy, unavailable through external examination alone. Animal dissection supplemented human anatomical study and provided more readily available educational material. Students dissected sheep, goats, pigs, and other animals whose anatomy showed significant similarities to human structure. The comparative approach helped students recognize both universal anatomical principles and species-specific variations. The animal dissections also provided practice in surgical techniques including incision, tissue separation, and suturing that would later be applied in human medical procedures. The anatomical curriculum emphasized systematic understanding of organ systems and their functional relationships. Students learned to trace blood vessels from the heart to the periphery, following their branching patterns and understanding their distribution territories. They studied the digestive system from mouth to anus, learning each organ's contribution to nutritional processing. They examined the nervous system, identifying major nerve trunks and understanding their roles in sensation and movement. This systematic approach developed comprehensive anatomical knowledge rather than isolated facts. Pharmacological education required students to master an extensive materia medica, encompassing hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral substances used in medical treatments. Students learned to identify medicinal plants in their natural habitats, distinguish them from similar species, and recognize optimal harvest timing when therapeutic properties reached peak concentrations. They studied preparation methods including drying, grinding, extraction, and compounding that converted raw materials into therapeutic preparations. The pharmaceutical recipes preserved on medical tablets demonstrate sophisticated understanding of drug interactions and synergistic combinations. Recipes often specified multiple ingredients combined in precise proportions to achieve therapeutic effects exceeding those of individual components. Students memorized these complex formulations through repetitive copying of pharmaceutical texts, while simultaneously learning the theoretical principles that guided recipe development. Dosing instruction emphasized the importance of appropriate quantities adjusted for patient age, body size, and condition severity. Medical texts preserved detailed dosing guidelines that specified different quantities for children, adults, and elderly patients. The attention to dosing reflects understanding that therapeutic substances become toxic at excessive doses and ineffective at insufficient doses. Students learn to calculate appropriate doses and adjust treatments based on patient response. Diagnostic training developed systematic approaches to patient evaluation that combined observation, questioning, and physical examination. Students learned to observe patient appearance, noting skin color, facial expression, posture, and movement patterns that indicated underlying conditions. They practiced eliciting symptom descriptions through structured questioning that covered pain location and character, functional impairments, appetite changes, and other relevant factors. They developed palpation skills, learning to detect abnormalities through careful touching of affected areas. The diagnostic curriculum included extensive symptom catalogues that students memorized through repetitive study. These catalogues described characteristic symptom patterns associated with specific diseases, providing diagnostic frameworks that guided clinical reasoning. The symptom descriptions achieved remarkable precision, distinguishing subtle variations that indicated different underlying conditions or disease stages. The diagnostic sophistication evident in these texts demonstrates that Mesopotamian medicine had progressed far beyond simplistic symptom treatment, matching towards systematic disease classification. Surgical training progressed through graduated levels of complexity, beginning with minor procedures and advancing to major operations. Students initially practiced on animal tissues and cadavers, developing basic technical skills in controlled settings where errors carried no risk to living patients. They learned proper instrument handling, tissue manipulation techniques, and suturing methods through repetitive practice under instructor supervision. As technical skills developed, students progressed to treating minor injuries and performing simple procedures on actual patients under close supervision. These initial clinical experiences typically involved wound care, abscess drainage, and other procedures with relatively low complication risks. Supervising physicians observed student performance, corrected technical errors, and provided immediate feedback that refined developing skills. Advanced students gradually assumed responsibility for more complex procedures, including fracture reduction, tumor removal, and eye surgery. These procedures demanded greater technical skill, anatomical knowledge, and clinical judgment. Students performed them under progressively less direct supervision as their competency developed, with master physicians available to intervene if complications arose but allowing students increasing autonomy. The training of Mesopotamian astronomer priests required decades of education that imparted sophisticated observational techniques, mathematical calculation methods, and predictive modeling capabilities. Astronomical education began with basic celestial observation training, teaching students to identify constellations, track planetary movements, and recognize significant celestial events. Advanced training included mathematical techniques for calculating planetary positions, eclipse prediction methods, and the interpretation of astronomical omens. Tablet collections from Babylon preserve astronomical education texts that demonstrate the systematic development of expertise across multiple educational levels. Astronomical training represented perhaps the most mathematically demanding specialization available in ancient Mesopotamia. The field required mastery of advanced sexagesimal calculations, sophisticated geometric concepts, and complex computational procedures that exceeded the mathematical knowledge conveyed in basic scribal education. Students pursuing astronomical specialization needed both exceptional mathematical aptitude and extraordinary dedication to complete the lengthy training process. The foundational phase of astronomical education focused on systematic observation of celestial phenomena. Students learned to identify fixed stars and star groups, memorizing the positions and seasonal visibility patterns of major constellations. They studied the zodiacal constellations with particular attention, as these marked the path of the sun, moon, and planets across the sky. The constellation knowledge provided the spatial framework necessary for recording and communicating astronomical observations. Planetary observation training taught students to distinguish the 5 visible planets from fixed stars through their characteristic movements. Students learned to track planetary positions night by night, recording their locations relative to reference stars and zodiacal constellations. They studied characteristic planetary patterns including stations, retrogradations, and conjunctions that occurred as planets moved through their complex apparent motions. The systematic planetary observations created databases that would later support mathematical modeling and prediction. Lunar observation formed another crucial component of basic astronomical training. Students learned to recognize lunar phases, measure the moon's position against background stars, and time events in the lunar cycle with precision. The lunar observations supported calendar calculations that synchronized lunar months with solar years, enabling accurate prediction of festival dates and seasonal events. The importance of calendar maintenance in temple administration made lunar astronomy particularly significant. Solar observation techniques received careful instruction, despite the challenges of observing the sun safely. Students learned to determine solar positions through shadow measurements and horizon observations that avoided direct solar viewing. They tracked the sun's annual motion along the ecliptic, noting solstice and equinox dates when solar position reached extreme northern or southern positions. The solar observations enabled accurate determination of season lengths and supported agricultural planning. Eclipse prediction represented one of astronomy's most impressive achievements and received extensive instructional attention. Students learned the Saros cycle, an 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat with remarkable regularity. The Saros period equals 223 lunar months, a mathematical relationship students derived through careful analysis of eclipse timing records. Understanding the Saros cycle enabled prediction of eclipse possibilities years in advance, though refined calculations were needed to determine whether predicted eclipses would be visible from specific locations. The mathematical training for eclipse prediction required mastery of complex calculations involving multiple interlocking cycles. Students learned to compute the nodes where the moon's orbital plane intersects the ecliptic, as eclipses occur only when new or full moon coincides with nodal positions. They calculated the varying distances between Earth and Moon that affect eclipse magnitude and duration. They determined visibility zones for predicted eclipses, accounting for observer location and local horizon geometry. The astronomical calculation techniques preserved in instructional texts demonstrate remarkable mathematical sophistication. Students learned interpolation methods for estimating intermediate values between tabulated data points. They mastered extrapolation procedures for extending known patterns into future time periods. They developed error-checking techniques that identified calculation mistakes before they propagated through complex multi-step procedures. These mathematical tools enabled astronomical calculations of unprecedented precision. Planetary position calculation represented the pinnacle of astronomical mathematical achievement. Babylonian astronomers developed sophisticated models that predicted planetary positions months or years in advance, using purely arithmetical methods. These models incorporated multiple periodic terms that captured different aspects of planetary motion, including mean motion, periodic variations, and longer-term cycles. Students learned to combine these periodic components through complex calculations that yielded remarkably accurate position predictions. The astronomical education culminated in omen interpretation training that connected celestial observations to terrestrial events. Students studied extensive omen collections that documented correlations between astronomical phenomena and subsequent historical events. The omen texts covered planetary conjunctions, eclipse occurrences, unusual stellar appearances, and other celestial events that were believed to presage significant developments in human affairs. The interpretation of astronomical omens provided practical applications for observational and computational skills while connecting astronomy to royal decision-making processes. The education of scribes for administrative and legal service required mastery of extensive law codes, contractual formulae, and bureaucratic procedures through specialized training programs. Students destined for administrative careers studied collections of legal precedents, memorized standard contract templates, and practiced the proper formulation of official documents. Training included instruction in accounting procedures, resource management techniques, and dispute resolution methods that prepared scribes for careers in temple administration, palace bureaucracy, or commercial enterprise. The curriculum reveals sophisticated understanding of the knowledge requirements for effective governance. Administrative training emphasized systematic mastery of bureaucratic procedures that govern temple and palace operations. Students learned the hierarchical structures of administrative organizations, identifying positions, responsibilities, and reporting relationships that defined institutional operations. They studied the workflow patterns through which documents moved between administrative offices, understanding approval procedures, archival protocols, and communication chains that ensured institutional coordination. This organizational knowledge enabled graduates to function effectively within complex bureaucratic environments. The accounting component of administrative education taught systematic methods for tracking resources, recording transactions, and preparing financial reports. Students learned double-entry recording systems that maintained balanced accounts by recording both receipts and expenditures. They practiced calculating inventory levels, monitoring resource consumption rates, and identifying discrepancies between expected and actual quantities. The accounting instruction utilized realistic scenarios involving grain stores, livestock herds, textile production, and metalworking that reflected actual administrative responsibilities. Resource management training developed planning capabilities essential for effective administration. Students learned to project future requirements based on historical consumption patterns and anticipated activities. They practiced allocating limited resources among competing demands, applying prioritization criteria that balanced institutional needs. They studied procurement procedures for acquiring necessary materials through production, trade, or tribute collection. These management skills enabled administrators to maintain institutional operations efficiently. Legal education began with systematic study of law codes that established standards for contracts, property rights, family relationships, and criminal justice. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BC, and the later Code of Hammurabi from 1800 BC provided foundational texts that students memorized through repetitive copying. The law codes presented if-then formulations specifying circumstances and appropriate legal responses, creating frameworks for consistent legal reasoning. Students internalized these formulations through extensive practice that developed facility with legal thinking. Contract law received particularly detailed attention given its importance for commercial transactions and property transfers. Students learned standard contractual formulae for sales, loans, marriages, adoptions, partnerships, and service agreements. Each contract type followed conventional structures that included identification of parties, specification of terms, witness attestations, and date documentation. The standardization facilitated legal recognition and enforcement, while providing templates that scribes could adapt to specific circumstances. Practical contract drafting exercises required students to compose appropriate documents for specified scenarios. The exercises presented realistic situations requiring legal documentation and expected students to produce properly formulated contracts incorporating all necessary elements. Instructors evaluated the drafts for legal sufficiency, appropriate terminology, and conformity with conventional formats. This practical training ensured that graduates could immediately perform essential legal documentation functions upon entering professional practice. Dispute resolution training taught procedures for mediating conflicts and rendering judgments in contested cases. Students studied case precedents documenting how previous disputes were resolved, learning to identify relevant legal principles and apply them to new situations. They practiced hearing arguments from opposing parties, evaluating evidence, and formulating reasoned decisions that applied established legal standards. The training emphasized fairness, consistency, and clear articulation of reasoning that would enable parties to understand and accept judgments. The education also covered procedural requirements for legal proceedings, including proper notification of parties, rules of evidence, witness examination techniques, and documentation of proceedings. Students learned that legal authority derived not only from substantive correctness, but also from procedural regularity that ensured fairness and prevented arbitrary decisions. The emphasis on procedure reflected sophisticated understanding that legitimate legal systems require transparent, predictable processes. Advanced administrative training addressed diplomatic correspondence and international relations. Students learned conventions for official communications between rulers, mastering the elaborate courtesy formulae and hierarchical protocols that governed diplomatic exchanges. They studied treaty formulations, tribute arrangements, and alliance agreements that structured international relationships. This diplomatic training prepared scribes for service in palace bureaucracies that managed external relations. Taxation administration formed another crucial component of advanced training. Students learned assessment procedures for determining tax obligations based on land holdings, livestock ownership, and commercial activities. They studied collection methods, enforcement procedures for delinquent payments, and accounting systems for tracking revenue. The taxation knowledge enabled scribes to staff revenue collection bureaucracies essential for state finance. The integration of legal and administrative knowledge created versatile professionals capable of managing complex institutional operations. Graduates possessed both the technical skills to maintain bureaucratic systems and the legal knowledge to ensure operations conform to established legal frameworks. This comprehensive preparation enabled them to assume positions of significant responsibility relatively early in their careers. Sumerian education placed extraordinary emphasis on memorization, viewing the retention of vast amounts of information as fundamental to scholarly achievement and professional competency. Students were required to commit to memory extensive lexical lists, mathematical tables, legal formulations, literary compositions, and technical procedures through repetitive copying and recitation exercises. The pedagogical techniques employed to facilitate memorization included mnemonic devices, rhythmic chanting, visual organization of information, and systematic review procedures. The centrality of memory training reveals cultural values that prioritized mental capacity and information retention as markers of educational accomplishment. The emphasis on memorization derived from practical necessities of ancient literate culture, combined with cultural values regarding knowledge and intelligence. In societies lacking ready access to written materials due to the labor-intensive nature of tablet production, educated individuals needed to carry essential reference information in memory. A scribe who needed to consult tablets for basic vocabulary, standard formulations, or common calculations would work far less efficiently than one who had internalized this foundational knowledge. Memorization thus served practical efficiency alongside cultural ideals. The quantities of information students were expected to memorize exceeded modern educational norms by substantial margins. A typical graduate had committed to memory thousands of cuneiform signs with their various readings, extensive lexical lists containing thousands of vocabulary items, multiplication tables covering products to 20 times 20, numerous mathematical formulas, dozens of literary compositions, standard legal and contractual formulae, and specialized technical vocabularies depending on career specialization. The total memorized content for an accomplished scribe likely exceeded 100,000 discrete items. The pedagogical techniques employed to facilitate such extensive memorization demonstrated sophisticated understanding of memory psychology. Repetition formed the foundation of memory training, with students copying the same materials dozens or hundreds of times until automatic recall developed. The copying provided multiple memory encoding pathways, including visual memory of sign forms, motor memory of hand movements, and cognitive processing of meanings. This multimodal encoding created robust memory traces more resistant to forgetting than single-pathway learning. Rhythmic organization enhanced memorization of certain materials, particularly lexical lists and literary compositions. The lists often incorporated phonetic patterns or semantic associations that created memorable rhythms when recited aloud. Students chanted these materials in groups, with the rhythmic collective recitation reinforcing individual memory while maintaining student engagement during long memorization sessions. The acoustic dimension of memory training complemented visual learning from tablet reading and kinesthetic learning from writing practice. Visual organization of written materials supported memorization through consistent formatting that created spatial memory cues. Lexical lists followed standard layouts with predictable line lengths, spacing patterns, and organizational structures. Students developed spatial memory for information location within these standardized formats, knowing not only the content but also approximately where it appeared on the tablet. This spatial encoding provided additional retrieval pathways that facilitated recall. Mnemonic devices assisted memorization of particularly challenging materials. Students learned acronyms formed from initial signs of list entries, creating memorable codes that triggered recall of complete sequences. They developed associative links connecting new information to previously learned materials through shared elements or conceptual relationships. They created mental imagery associating abstract concepts with concrete visualizations that enhanced memory encoding and retrieval. Systematic review procedures maintained long-term retention of memorized materials. The curriculum included regular review sessions where students recited previously memorized content, refreshing memory traces before they faded. The review schedule followed spacing patterns that modern memory research recognizes as optimal, with reviews occurring at progressively longer intervals. Initial learning involved daily repetition, followed by weekly reviews, then monthly sessions, and eventually annual comprehensive reviews that maintained lifetime retention. Assessment procedures that required recitation from memory without reference materials provided both evaluation and additional memory reinforcement. Students who successfully demonstrated extensive memorization gained recognition and advancement opportunities. Those whose memory proved inadequate faced remediation or redirection toward less demanding career paths. The high-stakes nature of memory assessment motivated serious preparation efforts. Cultural attitudes toward memory elevated it beyond mere practical skill to mark superior intelligence and character. Mesopotamian wisdom literature praised individuals with retentive memories, associating memory capacity with wisdom and reliability. A person who remembered teachings, precedents, and commitments earned trust and respect. Conversely, forgetfulness indicated not only practical incompetence, but also moral deficiency, suggesting unreliability and irresponsibility. The emphasis on memory training created educational experiences markedly different from modern schooling that provides ready access to external information sources. Sumerian students internalized their reference libraries, carrying essential knowledge in mental rather than written form. This internalization created different cognitive relationships with information, as memorized content became integrated into thinking processes rather than remaining external data requiring retrieval. The memory skills developed through Sumerian education persisted throughout professional careers, with scribes continuing to expand their mental knowledge stores. Experienced scribes memorized new legal precedents, accumulated technical knowledge, and retained details of past transactions relevant to current situations. The continuous memory development across career lifespans created walking encyclopedias whose mental knowledge stores represented institutional memory, crucial for organizational continuity. Evidence for female participation in Sumerian formal education reveals a more complex picture than conventional assumptions about ancient gender segregation would suggest. Archaeological discoveries include tablets written by female scribes, suggesting that at least some women received advanced literary training. The most compelling evidence comes from the Nippur at Ur, where excavations uncovered tablets bearing female names in scribal colophons. Additionally, priestess positions required literacy and specialized knowledge that could only be acquired through formal education. While female students likely constituted a minority within the educational system, their documented presence challenges simplistic narratives about ancient educational access. The tablet catalogued as U16321 from Ur contains a colophon identifying its scribe as a woman named Nisaba Gamil. The tablet presents a standard literary composition copied as a school exercise, with the quality of writing indicating advanced scribal training. The presence of a female name in a school context demonstrates that women could access formal education despite the predominantly male student population. The significance extends beyond this single example, as multiple tablets from Ur and other sites bear similar female scribal signatures. Priestess positions provide the strongest evidence for systematic female literacy training. The high priestess of the moon, god Nanna at Ur, known as the Entu priestess, required extensive literacy to perform ritual and administrative duties. These priestesses composed hymns, maintained temple records, and supervised complex religious ceremonies demanding comprehensive education. The most famous Entu priestess, Enheduanna, daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BC, authored multiple literary compositions that rank among Mesopotamian literature's finest achievements. Enheduanna's literary corpus includes the Temple Hymns, a collection of 42 hymns addressed to temples throughout Sumer and Akkad, and the Exaltation of Inanna, a complex theological composition exploring divine feminine power. The sophistication of these works demonstrates that Enheduanna received education comparable to the finest male scribal training. Her literary production influenced Mesopotamian religious thought for centuries, with her compositions copied in schools long after her death. The cultural impact proves that female intellectual achievement gained recognition despite gender hierarchies. The mechanisms providing educational access to women remain partially obscure due to limited documentary evidence. Royal and priestly families clearly educated daughters destined for high priestess positions, maintaining family educational traditions that included females. Some evidence suggests that daughters of scribal families occasionally received educational opportunities, particularly in households lacking male heirs, who might continue scribal traditions. These daughters could maintain family professional legacies and potentially transfer scribal knowledge to husbands or sons. The social dynamics surrounding female education likely differed from male educational experiences. Women probably studied privately with family members or tutors, rather than attending regular school classrooms dominated by male students. This private instruction would have provided equivalent knowledge transmission, while avoiding social complications of mixed-gender classroom environments. The private educational arrangements left fewer archaeological traces than institutional schools, potentially explaining the limited evidence for female education. Certain professions accessible to women required literacy, and specialized knowledge suggesting educational pathways beyond priestess training. Female tavern keepers needed literacy for maintaining accounts and recording transactions documented in legal codes. Female merchants engaging in textile trade required computational skills for calculating costs, managing inventory, and documenting transactions. The professional requirements imply that practical commercial education was available to women pursuing these careers. Medical practice provided another domain where women could exercise professional expertise requiring formal training. Female physicians and midwives practiced medicine, though documentation remains limited. Medical knowledge transmission likely occurred through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling, but the knowledge required suggests systematic training comparable to male medical education. The combination of practical apprenticeship with literacy training would have enabled female medical practitioners to access written medical texts. The quantitative evidence suggests that female scribal education remained exceptional rather than common. Analysis of thousands of school tablets reveals that fewer than 5% bear female signatures, and even this figure may overestimate female participation if some signatures represent isolated copying exercises rather than comprehensive education. The gender disparity reflects broader social patterns limiting female access to professional training, while demonstrating that barriers were not absolute. The educational opportunities available to elite women exceeded those accessible to lower status females. Royal princesses and daughters of high officials received education preparing them for roles as royal wives, priestesses, or administrators of family estates. The education included literacy, mathematics, administrative skills, and cultural knowledge befitting their social positions. This elite female education served social reproduction functions, preparing women to manage households, supervise servants, and participate in elite culture. The ideological frameworks surrounding female education reveal tensions between recognizing female intellectual capacity and maintaining gender hierarchies. Literary texts praising female wisdom and learning coexisted with others emphasizing women's domestic roles. The contradiction suggests that Mesopotamian society acknowledged female intellectual potential while channeling most women toward domestic rather than public professional roles. The women who achieved educational access and professional accomplishment navigated these contradictory expectations through exceptional circumstances or abilities. The Sumerian educational model spread throughout the ancient Near East, adapted by successive civilizations who maintained its core structures while incorporating local variations. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian schools preserved Sumerian curriculum materials and teaching methods even after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language, treating it as a classical language of learning analogous to Latin's role in medieval European education. Archaeological evidence from sites across Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia reveals the widespread distribution of standardized educational texts in similar school architecture, demonstrating the remarkable reach and longevity of the Sumerian educational system. The Akkadian conquest of Sumer around 2300 BC under Sargon of Akkad created the first multi-ethnic empire in Mesopotamian history. Rather than suppressing Sumerian culture, the Akkadian rulers adopted and promoted Sumerian educational traditions. Schools in Akkadian cities utilized Sumerian texts as primary curricular materials, while adding Akkadian translations that created bilingual educational resources. This bilingual approach preserved Sumerian learning while making it accessible to Akkadian speakers. The Old Babylonian period from 2000 to 1600 BC witnessed the fullest flowering of the Sumerian educational tradition as transmitted through Akkadian cultural institutions. Schools throughout Babylonia used the standardized curriculum that had developed during the Ur period, maintaining remarkable consistency in pedagogical materials and methods. The lexical lists, literary compositions, and mathematical texts studied in Babylonian schools replicated those used in earlier Sumerian institutions with only minor adaptations. The persistence of Sumerian as the language of education long after it ceased being spoken natively parallels later educational traditions that used classical languages for advanced learning. Just as medieval European schools taught Latin centuries after it ceased being a vernacular language, Babylonian schools taught Sumerian as the language of scholarship and culture. Educated Babylonians achieved fluency in Sumerian through years of study, enabling them to read ancient texts and participate in learned discourse using classical language. The reasons for preserving Sumerian as educational language extended beyond mere conservatism. Sumerian texts contained accumulated wisdom, religious knowledge, and technical expertise that formed the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. Abandoning Sumerian would have meant losing access to this heritage. Additionally, the prestige associated with ancient learning made Sumerian education culturally valuable beyond its practical utility. Mastery of Sumerian marked individuals as truly educated rather than merely literate. The geographical expansion of Sumerian educational influence extended far beyond southern Mesopotamia. Excavations at Mari on the Middle Euphrates, at Amar in Syria, and at Hattusha in Anatolia have revealed schools using Sumerian curricular materials identical to those found at Nippur and Ur. These distant schools demonstrate that the Sumerian educational model spread across the entire ancient Near East, creating a broad zone of shared learned culture. The mechanisms of educational diffusion included both institutional transmission and individual mobility. Scribes trained in traditional centres like Nippur and Babylon carried their educational knowledge to new locations when they assumed positions in distant cities. These trained scribes established schools following familiar patterns, transmitting not only curricular content, but also pedagogical methods and institutional structures. The personal transmission ensured that distant schools replicated the educational experience of the original Sumerian centres. Trade networks facilitated educational diffusion by enabling circulation of texts and teaching materials. Merchants travelling between cities transported tablet collections that introduced Sumerian text to new regions. The commercial connections created communication channels through which educational innovations and curricular developments could spread relatively quickly across vast distances. The integration of educational and commercial networks accelerated cultural diffusion. The adaptation of Sumerian educational materials to local contexts produced variations that enriched the broader tradition while maintaining its essential character. Syrian schools incorporated local languages and literary traditions alongside standard Sumerian curriculum. Anatolian institutions added Hittite texts and historical materials reflecting regional concerns. These local adaptations demonstrated the flexibility of the Sumerian educational model that could accommodate diverse cultural contexts while preserving its core pedagogical approaches. The longevity of Sumerian educational influence extended into the first millennium BC, when Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires maintained traditional scribal education. Assyrian royal libraries like that of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh preserved extensive collections of Sumerian literary texts, demonstrating continued study of classical materials. The Assyrian scribal schools prepared students for administrative careers using curricula descended directly from original Sumerian programs established 2,000 years earlier. The Persian conquest of Mesopotamia in 539 BC marked a political transition, but did not immediately end traditional scribal education. Cuneiform schools continued operating under Persian rule, training scribes for administrative positions in the imperial bureaucracy. The educational continuity demonstrates the institutional resilience of the Sumerian tradition that survived multiple political transformations across 2.5 millennia. The eventual decline of cuneiform education occurred gradually as Aramaic alphabetic writing displaced cuneiform for practical administration during the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The simpler alphabetic system required less extensive training than complex cuneiform writing, making it more accessible and economically efficient for basic administrative functions. However, traditional cuneiform education persisted in specialized contexts, particularly for religious and scholarly purposes, until the final cuneiform texts were written around the 1st century AD. Sumerian education operated within economic structures that involved significant financial investment from both families and institutions, creating educational access patterns that reflected broader social hierarchies. Tuition fees, documented in administrative tablets, could represent substantial portions of household income, limiting educational access primarily to families with sufficient economic resources. However, temple and palace institutions also sponsored students, providing educational opportunities to talented individuals from modest backgrounds who could serve institutional interests upon graduation. The economic structures surrounding education reveal its role in social reproduction and mobility within Sumerian society. Administrative tablets from Ur document tuition payments, ranging from 1/2 to 2 shekels of silver annually, substantial sums given that annual grain rations for a labourer totaled approximately 60 shekels worth of barley. The tuition represented approximately 3 to 8% of a labourer's annual income, placing basic education beyond reach for poor families without external support. The financial requirements meant that educational access concentrated among families with surplus income beyond subsistence needs. Beyond tuition, families bore additional educational costs including materials, gifts to teachers, and support for students who studied rather than contributing to household income. Clay for tablet production, though not expensive individually, accumulated costs over years of intensive use. Reed styluses required periodic replacement. Students needed appropriate clothing for school attendance that maintained family dignity. These supplementary costs increased total educational expenses substantially beyond nominal tuition fees. The opportunity costs of education proved particularly significant for families dependent on children's labour contributions. Students spending full days at school could not assist with agricultural work, craft production, household tasks, or younger sibling care. The lost labour represented real economic sacrifice, particularly for farming families where children's work contributions affected harvest outcomes. The opportunity costs meant that education required not only cash expenditures, but also foregone family income. The duration of education magnified these costs. Basic scribal training extending 8 to 12 years represented sustained financial commitment that poor families could not maintain. The cumulative expenses over a complete educational career could equal several years of labourers' wages, an investment possible only for families with substantial accumulated resources or access to institutional sponsorship. Temple and palace sponsorship programs provided educational opportunities for talented students whose families could not afford tuition. These programs served institutional interests by creating pools of educated personnel loyal to sponsoring institutions. Temples sponsored students destined for temple administration, while palaces supported future bureaucrats. The sponsorship typically covered tuition, materials, and sometimes living expenses in return for service commitments upon graduation. Selection for institutional sponsorship involved evaluating both student aptitude and family loyalty to sponsoring institutions. Administrators assessed students' intelligence, memory capacity, and character suitability for scribble careers. They also investigated family backgrounds, preferring students from families with histories of temple or palace service. The selection criteria ensured that sponsored students would likely complete training successfully and serve institutional interests reliably. The economic returns to educational investment justified the substantial costs for families who could afford them. Scribes earned significantly higher incomes than agricultural labourers or unskilled workers. Administrative positions provided stable employment, regular rations, and opportunities for social advancement. The economic benefits meant that educational investment yielded positive financial returns over graduates' careers, though the extended training period delayed realization of benefits. Social mobility through education remained possible but limited. Exceptionally talented individuals from modest backgrounds could gain institutional sponsorship, complete training, and achieve positions surpassing their family's original status. However, the structural economic barriers meant that most educational access concentrated among families already possessing economic advantages. Education thus served primarily to reproduce existing social hierarchies while allowing limited upward mobility that legitimized the system. The concentration of educational access among elite families created self-perpetuating patterns where scribal families dominated the profession across generations. Sons of scribes received educational advantages including home tutoring, family library access, and professional connections that enhanced their educational success. These advantages made scribal families more likely to produce successful graduates who maintained family positions in subsequent generations. The economic organization of schools themselves varied between independent tuition-dependent institutions and temple-supported educational programs. Independent schools operated as private enterprises where masters earned income from tuition payments. These institutions survived through attracting paying students and maintaining reputations for quality instruction. Temple schools operated as institutional programs supported by temple resources, with costs covered by endowment income rather than student fees. The institutional support enabled temple schools to sponsor poor but talented students. The teachers' economic positions depended on school organizational models. Masters operating independent schools bore entrepreneurial risks but could accumulate substantial wealth through successful operations. Teachers in institutional schools received stable salaries but lacked independent business opportunities. The different compensation structures attracted different types of individuals to teaching, with entrepreneurial types favoring independent practice and security-oriented individuals preferring institutional employment. School discipline in ancient Sumer employed corporal punishment as a standard pedagogical tool, with detailed texts describing various infractions and their corresponding penalties. The Composition School Days describes beatings administered for tardiness, incomplete assignments, poor calligraphy, speaking out of turn, and leaving school without permission. Archaeological evidence includes disciplinary implements discovered in school contexts. However, texts also preserve accounts of students bribing teachers, suggesting complex power dynamics within educational settings. The disciplinary system reveals cultural attitudes toward childhood, learning, and authority that differ markedly from contemporary educational philosophy. The School Days composition provides the most detailed documentary evidence for disciplinary practices in Sumerian education. The text catalogues a remarkable array of punishable offences that reveal the strict behavioural expectations governing student conduct. The student narrator describes receiving beatings for standing up in class without permission, speaking without being called upon, walking outside the school gate during instruction time, improperly dressing, and failing to demonstrate respectful posture when addressing teachers. The frequency and variety of infractions suggests that maintaining classroom order required constant vigilance and regular disciplinary interventions. The specific punishments described in School Days centered on caning administered with reed rods. The text employs several different verbs describing the beating action, suggesting variations in severity or technique. Some beatings apparently involved multiple strokes while others consisted of single strikes. The anatomical targets varied, with some punishments directed at hands, others at backs, and some at unspecified body parts. The variations suggest a graduated disciplinary system where punishment severity matched offence seriousness. Archaeological excavations at school sites have uncovered physical evidence consistent with the textual descriptions of corporal punishment. Excavations at Nippur revealed reed implements approximately 40 centimetres in length, showing wear patterns consistent with repeated striking actions. The reeds found in contexts associated with school buildings likely served as disciplinary canes. The archaeological confirmation of textual evidence demonstrates that the disciplinary practices described in literary compositions reflected actual educational procedures rather than fictional exaggeration. The disciplinary authority structure placed multiple figures in positions to administer punishment. The Umayya held ultimate disciplinary authority and could punish any student for any infraction. The Ad-Duba possessed delegated authority to maintain classroom discipline during instruction. Additionally, specialized personnel, including the gatekeeper who monitored arrivals and departures, and the monitor who supervised student behavior, could administer punishment for infractions within their jurisdictions. The distributed disciplinary authority ensured constant behavioral monitoring throughout school environments. The offences triggering punishment extended beyond classroom disruptions to include quality failures in academic work. Students received beatings for poorly formed cuneiform signs, uneven line spacing, crooked tablet edges, and other aesthetic deficiencies in their written work. The emphasis on calligraphic quality reflects cultural values that associated beautiful writing with moral character and professional competency. Sloppy work indicated not merely technical deficiency, but also inadequate personal discipline and disrespect for the scribal craft. However, the disciplinary system was not entirely one-sided. The school days composition includes a remarkable episode where the student's father invites the Umayya to the family home, provides him with an elaborate meal, presents expensive gifts including new garments and a ring, and essentially bribes him to treat the student favourably. Following this generous treatment, the Umayya declares the student talented and destined for success. The episode reveals that parental influence could moderate disciplinary severity, and that teachers were susceptible to material inducements. The bribery episode suggests complex social dynamics within educational institutions where formal hierarchical authority coexisted with informal influence networks. Wealthy families could protect their children from excessive punishment through strategic relationship cultivation with instructors. The teachers supplemented their formal compensation through gifts from grateful families. These informal exchanges created patron-client relationships that softened the strict disciplinary regime for students from affluent backgrounds, while potentially making discipline harsher for those lacking family resources to offer inducements. The cultural attitudes toward childhood learning revealed through disciplinary practices differed substantially from modern developmental psychology that emphasizes positive reinforcement and intrinsic motivation. Sumerian education operated on assumptions that children naturally resisted learning, required external compulsion to sustain effort, and benefited from physical punishment that reinforced behavioral standards. The harsh discipline reflected broader cultural patterns of authoritarian family structures and hierarchical social organization. The texts also preserve evidence that some students developed strategies for avoiding or minimizing punishment. Students helped each other complete assignments, shared solutions to problems, and warned each other about teacher moods and disciplinary tendencies. These peer support networks created student cultures that buffered individuals against the full severity of the disciplinary system. The informal student cooperation represents rational adaptation to harsh institutional environments. The effectiveness of corporal punishment in promoting learning remains questionable, even within the cultural context that employed it. Modern research demonstrates that physical punishment creates anxiety that impairs learning, damages student-teacher relationships, and teaches obedience rather than understanding. However, in Sumerian contexts lacking alternative motivational frameworks, corporal punishment may have served functional roles despite its limitations. The threat of beating maintained minimal behavioral standards necessary for classroom instruction, while the actual administration of punishment reinforced teacher authority. The long-term psychological effects of harsh school discipline on Sumerian students remain impossible to determine from available evidence. Some individuals apparently thrive despite or perhaps because of the demanding environment, completing education successfully and pursuing accomplished careers. Others may have been traumatized or discouraged by the harsh treatment, abandoning education prematurely. The texts preserve mainly the experiences of successful students who completed training, creating survival bias that obscures the experiences of those who failed or withdrew. Sumerian schools served as crucial institutions for knowledge preservation, systematically copying and transmitting texts across generations to prevent the loss of cultural, technical, and religious information. The practice of creating multiple copies of important texts distributed across different institutions created redundancy that protected against localized destruction. School libraries, documented in administrative inventories, housed extensive collections that served both educational and archival purposes. The systematic approach to knowledge preservation reveals conscious strategies for ensuring cultural continuity across time, strategies that successfully transmitted Sumerian learning across millennia. The recognition that written knowledge required active preservation to survive represents a sophisticated understanding of cultural transmission mechanisms. Mesopotamian scholars understood that texts deteriorated physically, that libraries could burn, that political upheavals could destroy institutional collections, and that knowledge could be lost if transmission chains broke. This awareness motivated systematic preservation efforts that treated knowledge maintenance as an essential cultural responsibility rather than an automatic process. The school copying exercises that dominated student activity served knowledge preservation functions beyond their pedagogical purposes. Each time students copied literary compositions, lexical lists, mathematical tables, or technical texts, they created new copies that could survive even if original tablets were destroyed. The continuous production of fresh copies through normal educational processes created self-renewing knowledge repositories that maintained text survival without requiring specialized preservation programs. The distribution of identical texts across multiple schools created geographical redundancy that protected against localized disasters. When students at Nippur, Ur, Sippar, and other cities all copied the same literary compositions and reference texts, the knowledge existed in multiple locations simultaneously. A fire destroying the Nippur school library would not eliminate texts that survived in Ur's collection. This distributed preservation strategy proved remarkably effective, as demonstrated by modern archaeological recovery of multiple copies of important texts from different sites. School libraries complemented active copying with systematic archival collections. Administrative inventories from Ur describe library holdings organized by text categories including literary compositions, lexical references, mathematical tables, legal formulations, and historical chronicles. The libraries maintained master copies of standard text that served as exemplars for student copying exercises. These reference collections ensured textual accuracy by providing authoritative versions against which student copies could be checked. The physical organization of school libraries facilitated both preservation and access. Tablets were stored in ceramic jars that protected them from moisture and physical damage. The jars were labeled with contents descriptions enabling efficient retrieval. Storage chambers featured controlled environments with stable temperatures and low humidity that minimized deterioration. The sophisticated storage systems demonstrate that preservation received conscious attention rather than occurring accidentally. The curriculum selection process inherently involved preservation decisions, as choices about which texts to include determined what knowledge would be transmitted to future generations. The texts selected for educational use received continuous copying that ensured their survival, while texts excluded from curricula faced higher risks of loss. The curriculum thus functioned as a cultural filter determining which elements of knowledge would persist across time. The standardization of curricula across multiple schools reinforced preservation by ensuring that identical texts received copying in many locations. When all schools used the same sign lists, vocabulary collections, and literary compositions, these texts existed in hundreds or thousands of copies distributed across the entire Mesopotamian world. The standardization created massive redundancy that made loss of important texts extremely unlikely. The transmission of texts across political and linguistic boundaries extended preservation beyond Sumerian cultural contexts. When Akkadian schools adopted Sumerian texts as classical learning materials, They ensured Sumerian knowledge survival even after Sumerian ceased being spoken. The texts preserved in Akkadian educational contexts remained available for copying and study, extending their existence across additional centuries and geographical regions. The professional scribal communities that operated schools maintained institutional memories preserving knowledge about text locations, library holdings, and rare compositions. Senior scribes knew which schools possessed particular texts, enabling borrowing or copying when needed. This professional knowledge network created meta-information about text distribution that facilitated knowledge recovery after local losses. The conscious preservation strategies extended to creating deliberate archives intended for long-term storage rather than active use. Some tablets discovered in school contexts bear colophons indicating they were copied specifically for archival preservation rather than student instruction. These archive copies were often written with exceptional care on high-quality clay and stored in protected locations. The creation of dedicated preservation copies demonstrates explicit recognition of conservation as a distinct goal. The intergenerational transmission through teacher-student lineages created human preservation mechanisms complementing physical text collections. Master scribes taught students not only textual content, but also contextual knowledge about text's significance, proper interpretations, and historical backgrounds. This transmitted contextual understanding enabled future generations to appreciate and utilize preserved texts, rather than merely possessing them as artifacts. The resilience of the Mesopotamian educational system becomes apparent through its documented recovery from major political disruptions, military conquests, and even catastrophic floods. Following the collapse of the Ur III dynasty around 2000 BC, educational institutions relatively quickly re-established standardized curricula and teaching methods. The continuity of specific texts and pedagogical approaches across these disruptions suggests that educational knowledge was preserved through dedicated institutions and professional communities that maintained their traditions despite political upheaval. This resilience demonstrates education's crucial role in maintaining civilizational continuity. The Ur III period from 2147 to 2040 BC represented a golden age of centralized administration and cultural flourishing during which educational institutions achieved high levels of standardization and sophistication. The dynasty's collapse following Elamite invasion and internal rebellions created political chaos that destroyed many institutions and disrupted social order across Mesopotamia. However, the educational system recovered remarkably quickly during the subsequent Isin-Lhasa period, with schools operating according to curricula virtually identical to those used before the collapse. The mechanisms enabling this rapid educational recovery involved the survival of professional scribal communities that maintained institutional knowledge through the crisis period. Scribes who had been trained in Ur III schools continued practicing their profession under new political authorities. These experienced scribes re-established educational institutions, training new students according to the same methods they had learned. The personal continuity of trained professionals enabled institutional continuity despite political discontinuity. The physical evidence for educational continuity appears in the remarkable similarity of curriculum materials from late Ur III and early Old Babylonian periods. The lexical lists, literary compositions, and mathematical texts used in schools during both periods show nearly identical content and organization. This textual continuity demonstrates that the educational tradition survived intact through the political transition, with new schools implementing the same pedagogical program that had operated before the collapse. Archaeological stratigraphy at school sites reveals relatively brief abandonment periods between Ur III and Old Babylonian occupation levels. At Nippur, school buildings show destruction layers associated with the dynasty's fall, followed by reconstruction and renewed educational activity within a generation. The rapid rebuilding indicates that educational infrastructure received priority during post-crisis reconstruction, reflecting recognition of schools' importance for cultural restoration. The recovery from catastrophic floods provides even more dramatic evidence of educational resilience. Archaeological excavations at multiple Mesopotamian sites reveal flood deposits representing major inundation events that temporarily disrupted urban life. At Ur, a sterile clay layer approximately 2.5 meters thick represents a massive flood around 4000 BC. Following this catastrophic event, the city rebuilt and educational institutions resumed operation, maintaining curriculum continuity with pre-flood traditions. The preservation of educational knowledge through flood disasters required that critical texts and institutional knowledge survive the catastrophe. The likely mechanism involved advance warning that enabled evacuation of important tablet collections to high ground or protected storage. Alternative scenarios include survival of memorized knowledge in the minds of educated refugees, who reconstructed texts from memory after waters receded. Either mechanism demonstrates conscious efforts to preserve educational heritage through crisis periods. Military conquest represented another recurring challenge to educational continuity. The Akkadian conquest of Sumer, the Gutian invasion, the Amorite takeover, and numerous smaller conflicts all disrupted political structures and could have destroyed educational institutions. However, the invading powers consistently recognized educated scribes' value and maintained or quickly restored educational institutions. The pattern suggests that education possessed sufficient practical importance that even conquering powers prioritized its preservation. The Akkadian response to Sumerian education exemplifies how conquerors preserved existing educational traditions. Rather than imposing Akkadian educational models, Sargon and his successors adopted Sumerian schools and curricula while adding Akkadian language instruction. This inclusive approach preserved Sumerian educational heritage while adapting it to serve the multilingual empire's needs. The strategy enabled cultural continuity while facilitating political integration. The recovery speed following disruptions varied depending on crisis severity and duration. Minor political transitions caused minimal educational disruption, with schools continuing operation under new authorities. Major catastrophes like the Earth collapse required several decades for full educational restoration, but maintained core curriculum continuity throughout. The most severe disruptions involving complete urban abandonment required longer recovery periods, but ultimately re-established traditional educational patterns. The institutional structures supporting education demonstrated remarkable adaptive capacity that enabled survival through changing circumstances. Schools operated under temple sponsorship, palace patronage, or private enterprise depending on what organizational model suited current conditions. This structural flexibility allowed educational institutions to continue functioning regardless of specific political or economic arrangements. The adaptability proved crucial for maintaining operations across 2,000 years of political change. The professional identity and institutional loyalty of scribal communities motivated preservation efforts during crisis periods. Scribes understood themselves as guardians of cultural knowledge whose professional responsibilities extended beyond individual career interest to encompass preservation of civilization itself. This professional ethos inspired efforts to maintain educational traditions through difficult circumstances that might otherwise have caused permanent loss. The Sumerian educational model influenced subsequent educational developments throughout the ancient world, establishing pedagogical principles and institutional structures that persisted across cultures and millennia. Elements of Sumerian education appear in Egyptian scribal schools, Greek gymnasia, Roman academies, and even medieval European universities. The emphasis on standardized curricula, hierarchical instruction, systematic assessment, and professional teacher training that characterized Sumerian education became foundational principles in later educational systems. The remarkable longevity and adaptability of these pedagogical innovations reveals their fundamental effectiveness in transmitting complex knowledge across generations. The Egyptian scribal education system shows clear influences from Mesopotamian models despite Egypt's distinct cultural development. Egyptian schools utilize standardized curricula, professional teaching hierarchies, and systematic assessment procedures closely paralleling Sumerian practices. The similarities likely reflect direct cultural transmission through trade contacts and diplomatic exchanges that exposed Egyptian educators to Mesopotamian methods. The adoption of foreign pedagogical approaches despite strong indigenous traditions testifies to Mesopotamian education's demonstrated effectiveness. The spread of alphabetic writing might have been expected to eliminate demand for the intensive training required for cuneiform literacy. However, Greek education adopted many Sumerian organizational principles, despite using a simpler writing system. Greek schools employed hierarchical instruction, with specialized teachers for different subjects, utilized standardized texts for language instruction, and implemented systematic assessment procedures. These structural elements derived ultimately from Mesopotamian precedents transmitted through intermediary cultures. The concept of professional teaching as a distinct occupation requiring specialized training represents a Sumerian innovation that became foundational for all subsequent educational systems. Earlier informal knowledge transmission through family apprenticeship or casual mentoring did not require dedicated teaching specialists. The Sumerian development of professional educator roles with defined qualifications and career structures established the model that later societies adapted to their particular needs. The use of standardized curricula implemented across multiple institutions represents another Sumerian contribution to educational practice. Earlier education presumably varied according to individual teacher knowledge and preferences. The Sumerian innovation of centrally defined curriculum content that all schools, taught in identical sequences, enabled quality control and credential recognition across geographical distances. This standardization became characteristic of formal education worldwide. The systematic assessment procedures pioneered in Sumerian schools established the principle that educational progress required objective evaluation rather than subjective teacher judgment. The development of formal examinations, graduated difficulty levels, and certification standards created accountability mechanisms that improved educational quality. Later educational systems adopted and refined these assessment principles while maintaining their essential Sumerian character. The institutional preservation of knowledge through school libraries and systematic copying established another enduring educational principle: the recognition that knowledge required active maintenance, and that educational institutions bore responsibility for cultural preservation shaped subsequent library development and archival practices. Medieval monastic libraries and modern research libraries operate according to preservation principles first systematized in Sumerian schools. The integration of moral education with technical training originated in Sumerian schools that combined literacy instruction with transmission of cultural values through literary texts. This holistic educational approach that aimed to form character alongside imparting skills influenced subsequent educational philosophy. Greek paideia, Roman humanitas, and medieval Christian education all incorporated moral formation as essential educational goals, reflecting patterns established in Mesopotamian schools. The multi-tiered educational structure offering basic literacy training for most students and advanced specialized training for careers requiring technical expertise created a model that subsequent societies adapted widely. The distinction between general education, providing foundational competencies, and professional education, developing specialized expertise, remains fundamental to modern educational organization. This structural principle originated in Sumerian recognition that different careers required different knowledge depths. The economic organization of education through combinations of family payment, institutional sponsorship, and student labor established patterns that persist in contemporary educational finance. Sumerian schools utilized all three funding mechanisms, creating mixed economies that balance accessibility against quality. Modern educational systems continue struggling with similar tensions between universal access and resource limitations, employing financing models descended from Sumerian precedents. The emphasis on memory training as fundamental to education diminished with the development of printing and widespread text availability, but remained central to educational practice through the medieval period. The memorization techniques developed in Sumerian schools, including repetitive copying, rhythmic recitation, and systematic review, influenced pedagogical practices for over 3,000 years. Only with modern educational reform did memorization lose its dominant position, and even contemporary education recognizes its continued importance for foundational knowledge. The most profound mystery surrounding Sumerian education remains its seemingly sudden appearance as a fully developed, sophisticated system without clear evolutionary precursors. The earlier schools show complex organizational structures, standardized curricula, professional teaching staff, and systematic pedagogical methods that suggest long developmental histories, yet archaeological evidence for this gradual development remains elusive. Like many aspects of Sumerian civilization, the educational system appears to emerge abruptly around 3000 BC in a form that would persist with relatively minor modifications for nearly 2 millennia. This pattern suggests either rapid innovation or the preservation of educational knowledge from earlier, as yet undiscovered sources, the archaeological record reveals a fundamental discontinuity in human social organization occurring around 3500 to 3000 BC, when small agricultural villages transformed into complex urban centers within remarkably brief time periods. This urban revolution involved not only physical city development, but also the emergence of sophisticated institutions, including centralized governments, organized religions, and formal educational systems. The simultaneous appearance of these complex institutions across multiple domains suggests coordinated development rather than independent evolution of separate social subsystems. The cuneiform writing system itself demonstrates this pattern of sudden sophisticated emergence. The earliest written documents from Uruk around 3200 BC already display systematic sign organization, standardized formats, and complex grammatical structures. No clear developmental sequence shows gradual evolution from simple pictographs to full writing. The writing appears essentially complete in its initial manifestations, suggesting either extremely rapid development or inheritance from earlier undocumented sources. The educational infrastructure required to transmit cuneiform literacy must have developed concurrently with or shortly after writing itself. The complexity of the writing system made casual transmission through informal observation impossible. Mastering hundreds of cuneiform signs with their multiple phonetic and logographic values required systematic instruction of the type provided by formal schools. The absence of archaeological evidence for early experimental schools suggests that mature educational institutions existed from writing's beginning. The standardization evident in early educational materials presents additional puzzles. The lexical lists and sign inventories used in the earliest schools show organizational sophistication, suggesting long developmental refinement. Yet these sophisticated teaching tools appear in the earliest school contexts without apparent evolutionary predecessors. The standardization implies centralized curriculum development and coordination between schools that should have required extended institutional development. The pedagogical methods documented in early schools demonstrate psychological sophistication regarding how humans learn complex skills. The graduated introduction of new material, the systematic repetition for memory reinforcement, the use of multiple sensory modalities for encoding, and the structured progression from simple to complex all represent teaching principles that modern educational research has validated. The presence of these sophisticated methods in the earliest documented schools suggests either remarkable pedagogical innovation or transmission of long-established teaching knowledge. Several hypotheses might explain the apparent sudden emergence of sophisticated education. The rapid innovation hypothesis suggests that unknown individuals made brilliant pedagogical discoveries that were quickly adopted across Mesopotamia. This explanation requires believing that fundamental educational principles were discovered essentially simultaneously across multiple domains, an implausible scenario requiring multiple independent insights by different innovators. The lost precursor hypothesis proposes that educational institutions developed gradually during earlier periods, but that evidence has not survived or has not been recognized in the archaeological record. Pre-literate educational systems might have transmitted knowledge orally using teaching methods that left no physical traces. When writing developed, the mature oral educational traditions were rapidly adapted to literate contexts, creating the appearance of sudden emergence. This hypothesis faces the challenge that oral education typically lacks the standardization characteristic of early Sumerian schools. The external transmission hypothesis suggests that educational knowledge derived from earlier civilizations, whose remains have not been discovered or have been misinterpreted. This explanation fits patterns evident across multiple aspects of Sumerian culture, including advanced mathematics, astronomical knowledge, and architectural techniques that appear without clear development sequences. If earlier advanced civilizations existed and transmitted knowledge to emerging Sumerian culture, the sudden appearance of sophisticated education becomes comprehensible. The archaeological evidence supporting external transmission includes anomalous artifacts demonstrating technical capabilities exceeding documented Sumerian achievements, precision stone cutting requiring advanced tools, astronomical calculations requiring centuries of observations, and mathematical knowledge requiring sophisticated theoretical development all suggest inheritance from earlier sources. educational systems capable of preserving and transmitting such advanced knowledge must have existed to explain its presence in early Sumerian contexts. The linguistic evidence presents additional puzzles, as Sumerian shows no clear relationship to other known language families. Linguistic isolation might indicate that Sumerian speakers arrived from elsewhere carrying a fully developed language and cultural system, including educational institutions. The alternative explanation that Sumerian represents an indigenous development whose linguistic relatives have disappeared faces the challenge of explaining why no traces of related languages survive. The sudden emergence pattern characterizing Sumerian education parallels similar patterns in other civilizations, including pre-dynastic Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization, and early Chinese urban centers. The global pattern of sophisticated institutions appearing without clear precursors suggests either repeated independent rapid innovation, which seems improbable, or transmission from earlier sources that subsequent catastrophes have obscured. The mystery remains unresolved, awaiting either new archaeological discoveries revealing earlier educational development or new theoretical frameworks explaining rapid institutional emergence. The implications of this mystery extend beyond academic curiosity to fundamental questions about human cultural development and the preservation of knowledge across catastrophic disruptions. Understanding how sophisticated educational systems emerged provides insights into civilization's foundations and the mechanisms enabling knowledge transmission across generations. The Sumerian educational legacy persists not only through its direct influences on subsequent systems, but also through the unresolved questions it poses about humanity's earliest organized efforts to preserve and transmit accumulated wisdom. The evidence presented throughout this investigation reveals a profound truth that challenges conventional understanding of human educational development. The Sumerian school system represents not a primitive beginning point from which education gradually evolved toward modern sophistication, but rather a remarkably complete educational infrastructure that emerged with startling suddenness and maintained its essential characteristics across 2 millennia. The sophistication evident in the earliest documented schools, the standardization of curricula across vast geographical distances, the professional specialization of teaching staff, and the systematic pedagogical methods all point toward knowledge systems far more advanced than conventional models of cultural evolution would predict for societies barely emerging from preliterate conditions. The architectural evidence from Nippur, Ur, and other sites demonstrates that educational facilities were purpose-built structures incorporating sophisticated understanding of learning environments. The curriculum materials preserved across thousands of tablets reveal systematic knowledge organization and graduated instructional sequences that modern educational research recognizes as optimal for human learning. The professional teaching hierarchies, specialized training programs, and formal assessment procedures established that Mesopotamian educators possessed comprehensive understanding of how complex knowledge transmits across generations. These are not the fumbling first attempts of civilizations discovering education, but rather the refined products of mature pedagogical traditions. The mystery of educational origins remains perhaps the most significant puzzle. The absence of clear developmental sequences showing gradual evolution from simple to complex educational structures suggests either extraordinarily rapid innovation or inheritance from earlier sources not yet documented in the archaeological record. The latter explanation gains credibility when examined alongside similar patterns of sudden sophisticated emergence, characterizing other aspects of Sumerian civilization, including mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and administrative systems. The convergence of multiple advanced knowledge domains appearing simultaneously without apparent precursors points towards systematic knowledge preservation and transmission from sources predating conventional historical timelines. The resilience demonstrated by Mesopotamian educational institutions through political catastrophes, military conquests, and natural disasters reveals conscious strategies for knowledge preservation that successfully maintained cultural continuity across millennia of upheaval. The distributed preservation through multiple school copies, the professional communities maintaining institutional memory, and the adaptive organizational structures enabling survival through changing political circumstances all testify to sophisticated understanding of how knowledge survives across time. These preservation strategies proved remarkably effective, transmitting Sumerian learning not only through ancient Mesopotamian civilization, but onward through successor cultures to influence educational development worldwide. The global legacy of Sumerian educational innovations persists in contemporary schooling systems that still employ standardized curricula, hierarchical instruction, systematic assessment, and professional teaching careers. The pedagogical principles discovered or preserved by Sumerian educators proved so fundamentally effective that they have survived 5,000 years of cultural change and technological transformation. Modern education remains recognizably descended from patterns established in those mud brick schoolhouses where students first sat in rows copying exercises onto clay tablets under stern instructors who understood that civilization's continuation depended upon successful transmission of accumulated knowledge to each new generation. As contemporary civilization grapples with questions about optimal educational methods, the preservation of knowledge through technological disruption, and the balance between standardization and innovation in learning systems, the Sumerian example offers both inspiration and warning. The sophistication they achieved demonstrates human capacity for creating effective knowledge transmission systems even with limited technological resources. Their successful preservation of learning through repeated catastrophes proves that determined institutional commitment can maintain cultural continuity despite severe disruptions. Yet the mystery of their origins reminds us that knowledge once possessed can be lost, that civilizational achievements can disappear leaving only fragments for future generations to puzzle over, and that our current educational systems, however sophisticated they appear, may themselves represent recovered fragments of older, perhaps more complete understanding of how human beings learn and how wisdom transmits across the generations that must carry civilization forward into an uncertain future.